Hey guys, tonight we descend into a world where a simple sneeze wasn't just a reflex, it was a message from the gods, a political pause button, and in some unlucky cases, a trigger for complete social humiliation. You're strolling through the stone-paved streets of ancient Rome, toga tucked just right, trying to avoid puddles, pickpockets, and plague gossip. Everything's humming along nicely, until someone near you lets out a sudden, resounding "Akoo!" Everyone freezes. You freeze. An elderly woman across the market starts muttering to herself. A senator's cupbearer drops a pitcher of wine. A chicken flaps off down an alley. You've just witnessed a cultural landmine, the sneeze. In our time, a sneeze is a minor inconvenience, or maybe a suspicious sign you're getting sick. But in ancient Rome, it could be an omen, a prophecy, or even grounds to delay a wedding, cancel a battle, or vote no on a major law. You probably won't survive this if you go around sneezing in the wrong direction on the wrong day in front of the wrong people. Seriously, keep your nose in check. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And drop your location and what time it is where you are. I love seeing the global bedtime map light up. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You begin in the heart of the Roman Republic. Picture it. Vendors are yelling over baskets of olives and grapes, kids are chasing each other with wax tablets, and in the middle of the chaos, someone sneezes. Everyone stops. The rule here? You must say, "Salve," the Roman equivalent of "bless you," but with a little more oomph, meaning good health to you. But why the fuss? The Romans believed sneezing was the body's way of expelling evil spirits, especially the kind that could enter through your nostrils while you slept, ate, or had politically charged conversations. A sneeze meant something had just left or tried to sneak in. This belief wasn't just superstition. It was woven into daily rituals, taboos, and even the legal system. The idea that sneezes were winds from the divine meant they were treated with a sort of paranoid reverence. You couldn't just sneeze and move on. That would be spiritually reckless. You had to address the sneeze, acknowledge the gods, and if necessary, make it up to Jupiter for not warning him first. In some cases, a sneeze was considered a sign that the gods agreed with whatever had just been said. If someone was mid-sentence, arguing for a policy or decision, and a sneeze rang out, especially from the right side, it was interpreted as a celestial endorsement. Senators would sometimes even look for sneezers in the crowd, hoping to time their statements just right. It was ancient Rome's version of cue the applause. Historians still argue whether these interpretations came purely from religion or were quietly weaponized for political gain. After all, if you can control the narrative around sneezes, you can tilt fate in your favor. And yes, there are records of people hiring fake sneezers. Not kidding. It's like ancient lobbying, but with more pepper. One popular tale, probably exaggerated but deliciously dramatic, tells of a minor priest who once sneezed loudly during the reading of a bad omen scroll. The ceremony was halted, people gasped, the scroll was burned. The priest naturally was promoted. Did the gods really bless him, or did he just time it perfectly after downing a suspicious amount of powdered mint leaf? Scholars debate. In the home, sneezing came with household-specific customs. Some families kept little carved wooden idols near the door. If someone sneezed before stepping out, they'd touch the idol for protection. Others kept bundles of rosemary on hand, believed to guard against the spirits trying to ride in on those gusts. You couldn't just sneeze and leave. That would be asking for trouble. Even marriage proposals could hinge on the timing of a sneeze. If someone sneezed while a proposal was being made, it was seen as a message from the gods, though what message exactly depended on the number of sneezes. 1 sneeze? Good omen. 2? Questionable. 3? Cancel your plans and go light a candle to Minerva. Some households even had sneeze tally bowls. No joke. You'd drop in a pebble every time someone sneezed during the day. At sunset, you'd count them and interpret what kind of omens had been swirling through the house. Imagine explaining that to your kids. You wander into a bustling tavern near the Aventine Hill. A man sneezes once and gets clapped on the back. Twice, and the mood sours. By the 3rd sneeze, someone hurls a piece of bread at him. Not because he's annoying, but because now he's marked. In a place this old, this superstitious, you don't mess with patterns of threes. Now let's talk about that crucial Roman invention, the sneeze signal. If you sneezed accidentally during a meal, especially when guests were present, you had to follow it with a statement of intent. "May my enemies fall" was a popular one. If you said nothing, people assumed you were hexing the bread or poisoning the olives. Polite society? Not without a sneeze ritual. In temples, the act of sneezing was considered sacred. Some rituals even required an artificial sneeze, induced with crushed flowers or scented oils, as a sign that the participant had fully opened themselves to divine influence. It's like emotional vulnerability, but nasal. And yes, if you're wondering whether there were ever people who exploited these rules for dramatic flair, absolutely. Ancient gossip scrolls tell of one merchant who faked sneezing whenever someone asked about the quality of his wine. He'd then mutter, "Let Bacchus judge," and avoid answering. Bold move, probably terrible wine. A more somber note, sneezes during funerals were taken extremely seriously. If someone sneezed while the body was being prepared, it was seen as the spirit rejecting the ceremony. You'd have to start over, rearrange the offerings, and sometimes even rewrap the body. Nothing ruins a quiet Roman funeral like a sudden coup. Quirky? Yes. But it was all rooted in the Roman obsession with signs. Life was chaotic, disease was common, and the gods were seen as ever watchful. A sneeze wasn't just a tickle, it was a message. And whether it came from Jupiter or a dusty corner of your insular apartment, it had to be taken seriously. Still, even in this hyper-superstitious culture, some thinkers pushed back. Pliny the Elder, bless his skeptical heart, wrote once that sneezes were probably just agitations of the inner breath. But then again, Pliny also thought thunder came from fire trapped in clouds, so grain of salt. You're standing in the middle of a Roman street festival now. There's incense burning, flutes playing, and someone nearby is laughing way too hard at a mildly funny amphora pun. Then it happens again. A sneeze cuts through the celebration like a divine interruption. This time it's a child, no older than 7, who sneezes once, then twice. The adults around her go still. An older woman leans down, touches her shoulder and says, "Jupiter's little wind has spoken." Yes, that's what they called it. The sneeze in Roman culture was often interpreted as a little wind from Jupiter. A divine breeze forced through your body, a celestial puff of air meant to remind you that you are not entirely in control of your destiny, or even your nasal passages. It was both charming and alarming. Romans saw Jupiter as the king of the gods, the ultimate authority. So if he decided to make your nose blast air at your dinner guests, you paid attention. This belief meant sneezes could carry layered meanings. Sometimes they were signs of protection, Jupiter shielding you from something worse. Other times, they were considered subtle corrections, like the god lightly flicking your ear to say, "Maybe don't marry that guy." And while modern science gives us a neat explanation involving the trigeminal nerve and nasal irritants, the Romans preferred theirs seasoned with thunderbolts and divine timing. You couldn't escape the idea that Jupiter was watching, not from above, but through your nose. Historians still argue whether this association with Jupiter originated from older Greek beliefs. Zeus, too, was connected with omens and sneezing, or whether it developed independently in Roman popular spirituality. Some even suggest it was a way for priests to control behavior by implying divine surveillance in the most mundane moments. One recorded example of Jupiter's wind turning into political theatre happened in 89 BCE. A minor tribune named Caecilius was mid-rant in the Senate about grain prices, passionate, sweaty, and just about to get to his point, when a senator across the chamber sneezed with violent flair. Everyone fell silent. The speaker froze, the audience waited. And then, a voice from the back, "The gods have interrupted your price fixing." Laughter, chaos, debate adjourned. You, of course, would have been smart enough to wait for the sneeze to pass before delivering your big argument. That's just respectful strategy. And if you ever sneezed while praying, oh, buckle up. That was considered extremely potent. Jupiter was not just dropping by, he was stepping into the room. You'd be expected to pause, reoffer your prayer, and possibly sweeten the deal with some honey cakes or incense. After all, if the divine chose to sneeze through you mid-ritual, you didn't keep mumbling your grocery list of wishes like nothing happened. By the time of Augustus, the idea of the divine sneeze had entered literature, performance, and even street slang. Caught Jupiter's breeze became a popular euphemism for someone who had suddenly changed their mind, cancelled plans, or chickened out last minute. You'd hear whispers in the forum like, "He was supposed to duel this morning, but caught Jupiter's breeze just before dawn." And everyone would nod as if that made perfect sense. But of course, not every sneeze was seen as sacred. Some were suspect, like left-side sneezes. Romans believed direction mattered. A sneeze on your right side was generally positive, right being associated with light luck and favourable omens. A sneeze on the left, trouble, possibly death, or worse, taxation. If someone sneezed on your left while you were walking to a business meeting or a first date, you'd turn around and go home. Seriously. The superstition was so strong that there were even detour routes for certain streets known for leftward sneeze gusts. These weren't scientifically mapped, of course, just oral rumours passed around like sour wine. This directional obsession extended to seating arrangements. Banquets, weddings, and council meetings all had designated spots for positive sneeze reception. It's like feng shui for nostrils. You didn't want to be in the bad sneeze line of sight. That was a one-way ticket to public embarrassment or divine rejection. One fringe scholar even claimed there were small wind vanes carved on rooftops to track the flow of sneeze spirit energy. Most historians roll their eyes at that one, but hey, it's Rome. If they could invent concrete and underfloor heating, they could absolutely carve some nose-wind arrows on rooftops. In military camps, things got stranger. If a soldier sneezed before a battle, especially on the left side, it was grounds to halt the march and consult the augurs. These were the official birdwatchers of Rome, who interpreted omens from the sky. Imagine being in full armor, sweating in the sun, your sword rattling against your belt, and then everything stops because Decimus behind you sneezed twice and everyone thinks Mars is mad. In some units, soldiers developed their own counter-rituals. One involved touching the hilt of your sword and whispering "securus," meaning safe. Another required sneezing again quickly to even it out. You could actually hear whispers of make it two after someone's first sneeze. Think of it like knocking on wood, but in Latin and with more anxiety. Historians still debate whether these sneeze superstitions in the army were imposed from the top or grew organically from the ranks. Either way, they influenced military decisions. There's even a record of a scouting party turning back from a recon mission because 3 soldiers sneezed in sequence, left, right, left. The commander called it a zigzag of doom. Honestly, kind of catchy. You pass through a merchant alley next and the smell of spices makes your own nose twitch, but you resist. You've heard the stories. One merchant swore his luck turned for the worse after a pepper-induced sneeze during inventory day. He tried to explain it was just bad seasoning placement, but the damage was done. 2 camels fell ill, a wine shipment exploded in the heat, and his mother-in-law moved in. To avoid such chaos, some Romans carried sneeze stones, smooth pebbles wrapped in leather, infused with herbs that you could grip tightly when you felt a sneeze coming on. Supposedly, they grounded the sneeze spirit and redirected it toward a neutral fate. Were they placebo? Absolutely. Did they sell well in the markets? Also, yes. And of course, every household had its own sneeze law. Some believed that sneezing while eating fish was good luck. Others thought it meant the fish was cursed. Some thought sneezing during childbirth meant twins were coming. Others thought it meant you needed to name the baby after whoever was closest. That's how one poor baker's apprentice ended up with the name Publius Breadboyus. By now, your feet are sore from walking. Your ears are buzzing from flute music and superstition, and your brain's starting to feel the first lull of sleep creep in. But the Romans? They're just getting started. Because, as you're about to discover, they didn't stop at divine winds and left-right luck. No. They invented a whole playbook, a sneeze protocol for nearly every situation imaginable. And trust me, the rules are about to get way weirder. You wake up in your humble domus, sunlight filtering in through linen curtains, pigeons cooing from the roof tiles, and you sneeze. Loud. Once, then again, and again. By your 3rd sneeze, you're sitting up in bed with your hand over your chest, because you already know what this means. You're cursed. or lucky, or you need to buy figs. It all depends on the day of the week and who heard you. Because in ancient Rome, not all sneezes were created equal, and definitely not all sequences. This brings you to one of the strangest of their beliefs, the double sneeze, or worse, the dreaded triple. You see, the Romans had a complicated relationship with consecutive sneezes. 1 sneeze? Fine. 2? Concerning. 3? Time to call the priest, the neighbor, and probably your lawyer. The issue was rooted in their obsession with signs and patterns. 1 sneeze might be an omen, but 2 or more. That was a conversation with the divine, and not necessarily a friendly one. Historians still argue whether these beliefs were strictly religious or mixed with health-based folklore. Ancient texts show that while some Romans viewed a single sneeze as lucky, especially in the morning, multiple sneezes in a row were interpreted as the body rejecting something dangerous. That could be poison. That could be an idea. That could be your new boyfriend. The philosopher Seneca once wrote that the body speaks in repetition when the mind does not listen. Which sounds profound until you realize he was probably just mad about someone sneezing during one of his monologues. So what did a double sneeze actually mean? In polite society, it required a response. If you were around others and sneezed twice, someone had to say something. Preferably a short prayer or blessing to ward off the evil that had tried to enter you, or had already gotten in and was now rattling around your soul like a drunk ghost. One popular response was, Bene tibi sit, may it be well with you. Another was more urgent, Numina te videant, may the spirits see you, which sounds nice but kind of implies you're invisible to the gods, and that's a problem. Now, if you sneezed 3 times, you were expected to do more than just sniffle into your tunic. You'd need to sit down, literally. The triple sneeze sit-down was a common response in homes and public spaces. You'd plant yourself firmly on a stool, bench, or barrel, whatever was closest, and offer a small vow, often to Jupiter or Minerva. Something like, I give thanks and ask no more, which was shorthand for, please stop whatever celestial roasting is happening to me right now. Children, meanwhile, were trained early. If a child sneezed more than once, older relatives would tie a small piece of red wool around their wrist, believed to protect against the sneeze curse. Some even painted tiny dots of ochre on their cheeks to confuse wandering spirits. Because nothing says holy protection like drawing freckles on a baby. There were even legal cases that hinged on sneezing. One record from the early 1st century CE tells of a land dispute where the final agreement was interrupted by a witness sneezing twice in rapid succession. The seller took it as a bad omen, backed out, and the buyer sued. The judge ruled in favor of the sneezer. The gods have no schedule, he said. And then, of course, there were the real dramatists, the Romans who faked sneezes for attention, manipulation, or just sheer mischief. You can imagine it, can't you? Someone leaning against a column, pretending to ponder something deep, then suddenly, achoo, achoo! Followed by a pause, and then a whispered, I think the gods have spoken. Did people believe them? Sometimes. Especially if the person was high-ranking or well-dressed. A sneeze from a well-oiled senator was considered more credible than one from a sweaty fishmonger. Classism, yes, but also hygiene. To combat false sneeze prophets, some households developed what were known as sneeze patterns. These were personal sneeze logs, seriously, kept by scribes or matriarchs to track how often a person sneezed and in what context. If someone claimed to have had a divine sneeze on a Tuesday, but the record showed their last sneeze was Saturday during goat washing, they were outed as a sneeze liar. One fringe belief involved the sneeze echo. This wasn't an actual sound echo, but a belief that if someone sneezed near you and you sneezed shortly after, you were spiritually linked to them for a day. You were encouraged to walk together, eat together, or avoid certain decisions. Because if the gods had made you sneeze in sync, clearly you were meant to share a destiny, or at least an awkward dinner. Gladiators, for example, were known to avoid training near anyone who had sneezed 3 times that morning. Superstition ran wild in those dusty arenas. One gladiator reportedly scratched the number of his daily sneezes into the dirt before every match. When he hit 3, he refused to fight. His nickname became Trementius, a play on tres, 3, and mentar, to fear. He died peacefully, by the way. of old age. Coincidence? Who knows? Now here's the best part. Some days of the week had specific sneeze rules. Mondays, a sneeze in the morning meant good fortune. Tuesdays, disaster, unless countered with a basil leaf tucked under your sandal. Wednesdays, neutral. Thursdays, sneezing before noon was fine. After noon, suspicious. Friday, sneezes meant love was coming. Saturday, travel luck. Sunday, don't sneeze, just don't. No one's sure why. Historians still scratch their heads. These weekly sneeze codes were often included in family calendars or written in the margins of household almanacs. You'd get up, check the time, note the direction of the wind, and then, if you sneezed, well, you'd consult the chart. By the late Empire period, elite households even began hiring auspex sternutators, sneeze augurs. People whose job was to interpret sneezes the same way a priest might read bird flight or sacrificial livers. Did they actually believe their own interpretations? Maybe. Or maybe it was just a very clever career pivot for failed poets. You're beginning to see just how far it went. The sneeze was a whole ecosystem of ritual, superstition, politics, and theatre. It wasn't just about germs. It was about the gods, fate, social status, and sometimes just how convincingly you could hiccup and call it prophecy. And even though modern science would eventually sweep in with explanations about allergens, dust mites, and histamine reactions, the emotional architecture of the Roman sneeze code lingered. Because humans have always wanted to assign meaning to the involuntary, to see purpose in the chaos, to believe that even the smallest, most absurd moments like air blasting out your face might mean something more. So next time you sneeze, maybe don't just wipe your nose and move on. Maybe pause, look around, notice who reacts, and then whisper quietly, "Numina te videant," just in case. You're passing through the Roman Forum now, one of those slow days where everything seems a little too quiet, as if the marble columns themselves are holding their breath. You notice a group of citizens standing near a basilica, deep in conversation. One of them sneezes. Instantly the others pivot toward him, hands up, murmuring in perfect unison, "Salve!" It's not just politeness, it's protocol. Because when it came to sneezing in public, especially in Rome's more formal spaces like the Forum, temples, or amphitheatres, there was an entire social choreography expected of you. The sneeze itself was merely the beginning. In places of business or politics, etiquette dictated not only that you acknowledge a sneeze, but that you respond according to status, distance, and direction. Yes, there were rules about whether the sneezer was above you in rank, standing to your left or right, and how far away they were when it happened. If the sneezer was someone of higher rank, such as a senator or magistrate, the response needed to be formal. Something like salus per deos, meaning health through the gods, or fortuna sequatur, meaning may fortune follow. If you got lazy and said nothing, social suicide. You'd be remembered not as the man who brought olives to the feast, but as that guy who didn't bless Cicero's nose. On the other hand, if someone below your station sneezed, the correct response was far more casual. A simple veil, meaning be well, or even just a nod would do. You didn't want to overplay your concern. Too much enthusiasm could be seen as patronizing. If someone equal in status sneezed and you ignored it, that was seen as competitive, like you were challenging them to sneeze harder next time just to win. That's how weirdly competitive Roman manners could get. Historians still debate whether these layered customs originated in the aristocracy and trickled down, or if they evolved organically as a kind of unspoken social glue. What's certain is that violating sneeze etiquette in public could affect your reputation, relationships, and even employment. There's a letter from a patrician matron to her daughter, warning, "Do not forget to acknowledge the sneezes of your husband's friends, especially during meals. Better to bless their noses than curse your dowry." Distance mattered too. If someone sneezed within arm's reach, you were expected to respond audibly and with eye contact. If they were across the room, a nod sufficed, unless it was a temple. In sacred spaces, even distant sneezes had to be acknowledged, since ignoring them might offend the gods, who presumably had better hearing than humans. Now imagine you're in the Senate chamber. Marble walls echo every cough and whisper. You're seated on a bench beside two other citizens, one of whom is nervously preparing to speak for the first time. Suddenly, from across the room, achoo! Everything stops. The speaker looks around, unsure whether to continue. Someone in the back mutters, "Auspicious." Another counters, "Unclear." The debate is suspended for 8 full minutes, while a priest is summoned to determine whether the sneeze came from the right or left side of the chamber. True story. It's recorded in the commentary of Varro, who called the moment the most sacred interruption I ever witnessed. In extreme cases, a sneeze during public oaths could invalidate the entire proceeding. You'd be midway through swearing loyalty to Rome, and if someone in the crowd let one loose, you had to start over. Some legal scholars wrote long essays arguing that a sneeze from an enemy during your oath could be considered an act of divine sabotage, which of course led to abuse. Enter the sneeze interrupters. These were hired individuals, often low-status workers or even street performers, who were trained to cause accidental sneeze-like sounds at critical moments. Some would grind pepper or basil under their cloaks. Others used feathers or carried dusty sacks. All they had to do was sneeze at the right moment, during a land deal, a marriage contract, or a loyalty pledge, and the ritual had to be reset. One man, nicknamed Sternutio, became infamous in the markets of Subura for his ability to sneeze on cue. He was rumoured to have caused 5 broken engagements, 3 cancelled business mergers, and 1 interrupted funeral. Did he get paid well? Extremely. Did people chase him with sticks sometimes? Also, yes. You move further into the forum and approach the sneeze benches. Yes, they had those. Designated spots where people could sit if they felt a sneeze coming on. The idea was that sneezing while standing might knock a person off balance or cause them to misdirect their spirit. Sitting down was considered safer, plus it allowed others to respond properly. Children were taught sneeze etiquette early. Schools had morning recitations where kids would practice polite responses, just as they did with greetings or Latin grammar. One popular classroom chant went, 1 sneeze a prayer, 2 beware, 3 prepare, 4 no more. Catchy, huh? Even street performers incorporated sneeze humor into their routines. Mimes would fake exaggerated sneezes to mock the upper class. Jugglers might toss feathers into the crowd just to see who sneezed and then shout blessings like they were passing out bread. One famous performer, Pullox the Bald, had a whole act built around a sneeze that caused a Roman general to forget his name. And then there was the festival exception, days when sneeze rules were relaxed. During Saturnalia, for instance, sneeze etiquette was flipped. You were encouraged to sneeze as often and as loudly as possible. It was believed that letting loose one's inner wind during a feast was a tribute to Saturn's chaos-loving spirit. So you'd have entire rooms filled with intentionally dusty flowers and spices, people snorting lavender and sneezing in harmony like some kind of nasal orchestra. One poet described it as a temple of thunder from the nose. Still, outside of holidays, it was serious business, especially for women. A woman who sneezed in public had to navigate multiple layers of expectation. Too loud, and she might be seen as unladylike. Too quiet, and people might think she was hiding something, possibly demonic possession. Seriously. A sudden silent sneeze followed by a blank stare? That was prime someone called the priest territory. Some women carried sneeze fans, small decorated fans meant to both stifle a sneeze and signal that it was just allergies, not divine interference. Others wore small scent pouches with dried mint or chamomile, hoping to prevent sneezes altogether. A sneeze at the wrong moment, like during a prayer or a marriage procession, could mark you as unlucky, unfavored by the gods, or just inconsiderate. You pause near a small fountain and watch a mother gently pinch her child's nose after he sneezes. Not to be cruel, but to trap the spirit and keep it from escaping. She mutters something in Old Latin, kisses his forehead, and continues on. It's tender, and it's telling. Because in the end, Roman sneeze culture wasn't just about superstition or social rules. It was about control, finding meaning and ritual in something as wild and involuntary as a sneeze. It was a way to make the unpredictable a little less frightening, a way to take ownership of a world full of uncertainty. And in Rome, that world was filled with gods, omens, gossip, and laws, but also with pepper dust, windy temples, and the occasional nose that refused to stay silent. Now imagine you're standing in a dimly lit atrium, watching a heavily pregnant Roman woman be surrounded by worried family members because, wait for it, she just sneezed. Not once, not twice, but 4 times. The mood shifts instantly. Aunties start whispering. Someone drops a bowl of olives. The midwife rushes in holding a pouch of rosemary and a small bronze amulet in the shape of a turtle. Because when it came to pregnant women and sneezing, Romans weren't just cautious, they were deeply, almost theatrically, superstitious. A sneeze during pregnancy wasn't taken lightly. The body, in Roman understanding, was already considered open and vulnerable when carrying new life. Add in a sudden, involuntary expulsion of divine wind from the face, and you had what scholars today might call a spiritual emergency. Women were advised to carry sneeze shields, not the plexiglass kind, of course, but small protective items meant to spiritually dampen or redirect sneeze-related omens. The most common was a bundle of knotted red thread worn around the wrist or ankle, believed to confuse spirits trying to sneak in through the nasal passage. There was also the rosemary pouch, which had dual purposes, warding off evil and masking whatever unfortunate odors came from the nearby latrine. Historians still argue whether these sneeze customs had any real medical logic behind them or were entirely symbolic. Some suggest that the deep-rooted fear stemmed from the very real risk of miscarriage in a time with limited prenatal care. So sneezes, being sudden and forceful, were thought to potentially dislodge the delicate balance of pregnancy. Others think it was more about control. A society that couldn't medically ensure the safety of a pregnancy tried to ritualize protection instead. There's even an account from the writings of Plutarch where a woman was put on bed rest for 2 days because she sneezed during her 7th month. Her husband made an offering to Juno Lucina, goddess of childbirth, and insisted on sleeping in a separate room for a week, because apparently the sneeze had startled the womb. Some women performed daily nose rituals, rubbing lavender oil on the nostrils at dawn, while chanting protective verses to keep the sky spirits at bay. And you thought your morning routine was intense. It didn't stop there. There were even calendar restrictions around sneezing during pregnancy. For example, sneezing on the 3rd day of the calends, the Roman month opener, was believed to mean the child would be born with prophetic dreams. But sneezing during the Ides, that meant the baby might be shadowed, a term that loosely translated to likely to speak in riddles, sneeze a lot, and ruin parties. These beliefs bled into the birthing process too. Midwives were taught to watch for sneezing just before labor. 1, maybe 2 sneezes, a sign of strength. A 3rd, they'd light a bundle of fennel and place it under the birthing stool. The logic? That fennel smoke bridged the realms, meaning it would catch any malicious spirits trying to swoop in while the child was being born. Some fringe accounts, likely exaggerated, describe women giving birth with their nostrils pinched shut, so as not to release luck during the crucial final push. One particularly detailed tale involves a noblewoman who gave birth while a servant fanned powdered mint into her face to induce a sneeze right as the child emerged. The belief was that synchronizing the sneeze and birth would make the child forever open to divine messages. Frankly, it just sounds uncomfortable. And let's not forget about pregnancy amulets with sneeze-specific inscriptions. Archaeologists have found small charms shaped like noses, yes, really, with words like teneo spiritum, I hold the spirit. These were typically worn on chains around the neck or hidden under clothing. The idea was to reassure both mother and gods that the sneeze energy had been safely contained. As if pregnancy wasn't stressful enough, the sneeze rules didn't end at birth. Babies had their own sneeze expectations. A newborn who sneezed within the first day was considered blessed, visited by divine breath. Parents would throw tiny grain offerings into the hearth. But a baby who didn't sneeze in the first week, that was taken as a sign of weakness or spiritual blockage. Midwives would wave aromatic herbs under the baby's nose, hoping to wake the winds. By now, your head's probably spinning with all the sneeze-laced rituals. But it only gets more intricate, because these same rules extended to pregnancy announcements too. If a woman sneezed while hearing someone else announce their pregnancy, that was taken as a sign that she herself would soon conceive. Cue a cascade of congratulations, raised eyebrows, and offerings to Venus. In a particularly awkward case, two women reportedly sneezed at the same time during another woman's announcement, and both later ended up pregnant. Did they plan it? Who knows? But in the gossip-hungry social scene of Rome, nothing added fuel to rumors like synchronized sneezing. Sneezing even became a courtship signal. A man would present a handkerchief scented with thyme and basil to a woman he admired, hoping it might induce a sneeze. If she did sneeze while holding it and smiled afterward, it was considered a good omen. If she sneezed and looked annoyed, back to the wine shop, Romeo. You pass through a shaded alley and spot a set of stone tablets nailed to a wooden board, the remains of a long-defunct apothecary. Faded etchings show recipes for various ailments, stomach cramps, headaches, and yes, unlucky sneezing. One reads, "For the woman with unruly breath, boil 1 fennel root, crush with goat milk. Apply to the feet, recite Numen expecto, spiritum cedo, then sneeze freely." Basically, bless your feet, chant to the gods, and let it rip. What's striking about all this is how seriously sneeze law was taken, especially for women. It wasn't just folklore, it was lived instruction. You were taught these things the way you were taught to tie sandals or prepare barley porridge. And yet, despite all the seriousness, there was still humor woven in. Roman poets loved to mock sneeze rituals. One popular satire from Juvenal describes a woman sneezing so loudly during a theatre performance that someone shouted, "The gods agree with the plot," and half the audience applauded. Historians still debate whether these sneeze rules were enforced across all classes or just among the elite. Most agree that while upper-class women had the luxury of charms, priests, and private midwives, poorer women relied more on household remedies and whispered traditions. What united them was the shared belief that something as small and sudden as a sneeze could ripple through fate itself. As you walk away from the apothecary and back into the buzzing streets, it's hard not to marvel at how much energy this civilization devoted to one tiny bodily reflex. But maybe that's the point. In a world full of uncertainty, plagues, wars, backstabbing dinner guests, maybe sneezes were one of the few things that everyone experienced, and therefore everyone tried to explain. So next time someone near you sneezes, maybe don't just mutter, "Bless you," without thinking. Maybe, just maybe, consider that you're participating in a ritual older than empires. One that once involved fennel bundles, divine omens, red string, and at least one heroic woman giving birth while sneezing on purpose. You've barely made it past the bakery when you see a crowd forming near a dusty courtyard. The scent of fresh bread and roasted pine nuts drifts in the breeze, but nobody's paying attention to that. All eyes are on a man, shirtless under the hot Roman sun, pacing in a circle. He's got a wooden sword strapped to his back and an intense look in his eyes. A second man steps forward, armored and solemn. The two men nod, raise their arms. And then everything stops. You don't even blink before the crowd gasps. The sword drops. The challenger steps back. A whisper spreads like oil across stone. He sneezed on a Tuesday. And that, my sleepy friend, is how gladiators couldn't sneeze on Tuesdays. Of all the sneeze rules in ancient Rome, this one confounded even seasoned historians. It was a highly specific restriction. No sneezing before combat on the second day of the week. Not Monday, not Sunday, just Tuesday. Why? Well, some say it was rooted in the superstition around Mars, the god of war. Tuesday was named after him in many ancient calendars. Dies Martis, the day of Mars. And Mars, being the temperamental, muscle-bound embodiment of war and wrath, apparently did not appreciate sneezes. They were considered disrespectful in the moments before battle, like interrupting a general during a war speech to loudly clear your sinuses. Others believe the tradition came from a gladiator named Felix the Younger, who once sneezed before stepping into the Colosseum. He was immediately struck in the leg by a misfired javelin from a careless assistant. The crowd took it as an omen. Mars had rejected the sneeze. Felix limped out of the arena, embarrassed but alive, and started the tale that would evolve into full-blown protocol. Some versions of the rule were even stricter. If a gladiator heard someone else sneeze while sharpening their weapon on a Tuesday, they'd stop and resharpen it from scratch to remove the omen. Imagine the pressure. You're already about to fight for your life, and now you're performing nasal purification rituals before breakfast. Gladiator schools enforced these rules with what they called the sternutamentum mortis, the sneeze of death clause in their training codes. Young recruits were told to hold in any tickle of the nose until after battle. Some schools even issued nose clamps, small bronze clips you'd wear discreetly like a warrior's clothespin. Were they effective? Debatable. Were they dignified? Definitely not. And of course, there were sneaky workarounds. One technique was the pre-battle sneeze walk. A fighter would march outside the arena, pace 3 times in a clockwise circle while sniffing powdered bay leaves and sneeze intentionally to get it out of the way. Then, having satisfied the gods, or at least convinced themselves they had, they'd walk into battle with renewed confidence. Another was to pass the sneeze, yes, really. This involved touching the arm of a servant or stable boy after sneezing and saying something like, "May your strength catch my spirit." The idea was to deflect the sneeze's bad energy to someone with neutral fate. Did anyone want to be the sneeze catcher? Not particularly, but if you were paid extra or given leftover barley wine, maybe it wasn't such a bad gig. Historians still argue whether these customs were purely religious or part of gladiatorial psychological training. One theory is that prohibiting sneezes was a way to build mental discipline, to force focus under pressure. Another says it was all stagecraft, elaborate rituals that heightened the drama and spectacle for the crowds. After all, nothing grabs attention like a superstitious delay right before the clashing of swords. You wander past the training yard now, where wooden dummies are covered in chalk from repeated practice blows. In the corner, a young boy rubs a feather under his nose, giggles, then sneezes twice. A stern trainer snaps at him. "Not today, boy. Today is sacred." Even outside the arena, military culture adopted some of these sneeze taboos. Roman soldiers, especially in camp settings, had designated sneeze zones, small areas behind tents where you were expected to walk if you felt one coming on. They called it the area sternutandi, a literal sneeze corner. Why the drama? Because a surprise sneeze could cause confusion during sensitive operations. If you were on night watch and let out a loud sneeze, it could be mistaken for a whistle, a signal, or worse, a warning of an incoming ambush. So soldiers developed a kind of silent sneeze salute, clamping a fist over the mouth, turning sharply to the left, and then stamping a foot. It made no sense biologically, but was respected for its precision. Veterans taught rookies to chew a bitter herb called silenum to dull sneeze reflexes during critical missions. One soldier, named Cassius of the Ninth, even claimed he went 4 months without sneezing, thanks to a strict regimen of selenum tea and breathing exercises. Did it make him stronger? He thought so. Did it probably give him a perpetual nasal itch? Almost certainly. There's a funny story told in the margins of a medical manuscript about a Roman general who demanded complete silence during a night maneuver near Gaul. A soldier sneezed once and was immediately promoted. Why? Because the general took it as a sign from the gods that the path ahead was clear. He later retracted the promotion when the next hill turned out to be filled with angry tribesmen, but by then, the sneezer had already built a shrine to his own nose. You cross into a quieter quarter of the city, where a few retired gladiators now work as storytellers. One of them recounts how his most famous match was delayed for half an hour because both combatants sneezed at the same time. According to the audience, it was a double Mars rejection, and they were forced to return the next day wearing garlic necklaces as a protective charm. And yes, garlic played a huge role in the sneeze rituals of soldiers and fighters. It was believed to weigh down the spirit, preventing it from being jostled loose by sudden motions like sneezes. Soldiers would chew raw garlic before duels, partly for strength, partly for luck, and partly just to stink their opponent into surrender. There are even satirical poems mocking the garlic-nosed ones as warriors who mistook superstition for strategy. Still, as absurd as it all sounds, these rituals helped create a structure of belief, a psychological framework in which even something chaotic like combat could be mapped, managed, and made meaningful. Sneezing became not just a bodily reflex, but a narrative tool, woven into the stories soldiers told about courage, fate, and survival. And somewhere between the battlefield and the arena, between the clatter of armor and the whisper of feathers under the nose, the Roman sneeze code grew stronger. Not just a superstition, but a language. One made of blessings, delays, garlic, feathers, and nose clamps. So the next time you feel a sneeze coming on, picture a Roman gladiator pausing with his sword half drawn, muttering to himself, "Not on a Tuesday. Not today." And maybe smile, because sometimes even the mightiest warriors are at the mercy of a tiny tickle in the nose. You're stepping into a narrow Roman side street now, just wide enough for two men in sandals and one goat to pass without argument. The air smells of olive oil, dust, and someone's overcooked garum. In the distance, bells from a nearby barber shop jingle, and you drift closer, partly out of curiosity, partly out of instinct to avoid that goat again. And right on cue, someone inside sneezes. There's a pause, a tense one. Then comes the voice of the barber, dry as parchment. Heard that? That's the sound of lies. See, in ancient Rome, a sneeze in a barber shop wasn't just a bodily reflex, it was a warning. Not of illness, not even of omens necessarily, but of gossip, betrayal, or worst of all, a bad haircut. The Romans believed that sneezing while being trimmed, shaved, or even seated in a barber shop was a supernatural flare-up of secrets. It meant someone in the room was about to lie, or already had. And if the sneeze came from the barber himself, you'd be better off leaving with half a haircut than staying a second longer. These barbershop beliefs probably emerged from the unique atmosphere of the place, a mix of physical intimacy, idle chatter, and sharp objects. A man letting another man hold a razor to his neck while discussing politics or local scandals created the kind of tension ripe for superstition. If someone sneezed in the middle of this delicate trust dance, it was treated as a crack in the moral foundation of the moment. Historians still argue whether this idea came from Etruscan ritual cleansing customs, which also involved tools and purification chants, or whether it arose independently from the Roman tendency to assign mystical meaning to anything remotely uncomfortable. After all, sneezing while being shaved could make you bleed. And in Roman logic, bleeding plus a sneeze equaled spiritual interference. Basic math. Some barbers went full protection mode. They'd hang small mirrors on strings behind them, not to check their hair, but to reflect lies. One even wore a tiny bronze beetle charm on his belt to confuse the sneeze spirits. And yes, there were even shops that posted sternudamentum warnings on the door, meaning if you sneezed inside, you had to leave and come back in with your left foot first. That supposedly broke the sneeze's spell. Clients, too, got creative. It became common for men to pinch their noses or bite their tongues when the sneeze tickle came on. And not because they were shy, it was survival. You never knew who in the shop might be engaged in some quiet backstabbing or illicit deal, and nobody wanted to be the guy who sneezed at the exact moment another man whispered something about shipping schedules or someone's wife. If a sneeze still escaped, it was customary to counter it aloud, usually with a phrase like "veritas me tangit," truth touches me. Basically, you had to tell everyone you weren't the liar in the room. Whether they believed you or not was another matter. Some shops even kept sneeze seats, a slightly lower stool where unlucky noses were made to sit until their spiritual dust had settled. It sounds funny, but people complied. Social shame in Rome was serious business, especially when it could be tied to divine disfavor. You lean against the shop's outer wall, half listening to an argument brewing inside. One man sneezes and insists it's the pollen. Another accuses him of spreading rumors about olive taxes. The barber raises his hands and says, "No shears until someone sacrifices a plum." He's joking, probably. But this wasn't always a laughing matter. In some more serious cases, a sneeze during a shave could lead to outright accusations. One surviving document, badly cracked marble but still legible, records a dispute where a customer accused his barber of cursing him mid-trim by sneezing 3 times and then whispering something under his breath. The case was dismissed when the court learned the barber had seasonal hay fever. Still, the precedent was set. Sneeze plus scissors equals suspicion. The strange thing is how these customs managed to exist without ever being officially codified. There was no Roman sneeze law, no book of sneeze codes, and yet the expectations were widely understood, especially in places where trust, grooming, and reputation overlapped. Barbershops became hubs for not only haircuts but rumour circulation. A sneeze might signal that a topic was getting too heated, or that Jupiter himself disapproved of the conversation. And some gossips got sneaky, faking sneezes to derail uncomfortable conversations. Want to avoid discussing your cousin's tax evasion? Sneeze. Loudly. Bonus points if you follow it with, "The gods shiver at that name." Even writers of the time couldn't resist poking fun at the phenomenon. The poet Marshall once described a man who sneezed his way out of a murder accusation by timing a sneeze just as the accuser named him. The gods were seen as intervening. Or maybe he just got lucky. Either way, the crowd called for his release. You turn the corner now and come face to face with another type of barber, one of those street-side blade men who offer quick trims and cheaper rates. Even they had sneeze traditions. Most carried small bells they'd ring if someone sneezed nearby, believed to clear the air and neutralize bad spirits. And the rules weren't exclusive to men. Women's grooming spaces, though more private, had their own sneeze taboos. A woman sneezing while her hair was being curled or combed could be seen as warding off flattery, meaning that any compliment she received afterward was automatically disqualified. If she sneezed twice, the flattery was reversed. Some women carried perfumed cloths to disguise their sneezes, redirecting the divine energy toward beauty instead of blasphemy. Hairstylists would sometimes light a small sprig of juniper in response to a client's sneeze, wafting the smoke around the room while whispering, "Pulchritudo sine tumultu," beauty without disturbance. It sounds dramatic, but when your appearance determines social value, even the gods got involved in your hairdo. Historians still debate whether barbershop sneeze culture had any connection to Roman religious rites involving purification and transformation. Some argue that the combination of cutting hair and sneezing, both symbolic acts of release, created a potent blend of fear and awe. Others think it was just a bunch of guys overreacting to pollen season. Either way, the sneeze wasn't neutral. Not in this city. Even Roman playwrights got in on the act. In one lost play, Narcissus et Navis, The Nose and the Ship, a character sneezes during a haircut and is told he's doomed to shipwreck. He spends the rest of the comedy building boats and refusing to go near the sea. It's all very slapstick, but you can bet audiences laughed and nodded in knowing recognition. As the sun dips lower and shadows stretch across the stones, you hear one last sneeze echo from the barber shop. Short, sharp, unmistakable. No one says anything. Then the barber, slow and deliberate, mutters, "Cut's cancelled, come back tomorrow." And that, in essence, captures the Roman obsession with sneezing in its purest form, a society so attuned to ritual and signs that a sneeze could postpone a haircut, derail a lawsuit, or change the course of a conversation. Because in ancient Rome, truth wasn't just in words. Sometimes it came out of your nose, loud, involuntary, and impossible to ignore. You wander away from the barbershop, deeper into the neighborhood of Subura, a bustling Roman district full of rented insular apartments, wine shops, and the sort of characters whose names are always whispered, never spoken. Here, secrets slither faster than water down a mosaic floor, and you begin to notice something odd. Every time someone walks past a love letter stand, someone sneezes. Coincidence? Maybe. But in ancient Rome, sneezing while reading or receiving a love letter wasn't taken lightly. It was practically a public announcement. Let's say someone slipped you a folded wax-sealed scroll with a heart carved into the seal. Cute, right? Now imagine you open it, start reading a line that begins with "My dearest marble-hearted goddess," and achoo! Your whole body jolts. You look around, people are already staring. Because if you sneeze while reading a love letter, the meaning changes. Drastically. The Romans believed sneezing in this context was a celestial commentary. Either the gods approved of the relationship and were giving their little wind kiss of encouragement, or they were flat out rejecting it with a gust of disappointment. Historians still argue whether the original belief stemmed from Venusian temple practices, where offerings to the goddess of love were accompanied by strong-smelling herbs that could induce sneezing, or whether this was just another layer of social anxiety placed on already dramatic romantic lives. But it didn't stop at just one sneeze. The number of sneezes mattered. One sneeze while reading the letter? Good omen. The sender is sincere. Proceed with confidence and a little olive oil in your hair. 2 sneezes, mixed signals. The sender might be hiding something, perhaps a spouse or debts. 3 sneezes, dangerous. This is a player, or worse, someone from Naples. One popular superstition held that if both the reader and the sender sneezed within a day of exchanging letters, their relationship was doomed. That meant the gods were essentially playing hot potato with their emotions, and no one wanted to be caught holding the potato when the curse landed. Now imagine the chaos this caused for Rome's postal runners. Cursors, those poor guys who sprinted through the city with baskets of scrolls, sometimes with feathers, sometimes barefoot. There were reports of entire batches of love letters being returned because the recipient sneezed mid-read and decided, the gods have spoken. This is a no. You step into a shadowy colonnade where a group of young scribes sits at a stall copying love poetry for paying clients. One of them, a curly-haired teenager named Spurius, offers you a scroll titled Ode to Her Cheeks, round as the Tiber moon. You decline, but stay long enough to watch a woman read a poem aloud. She gets halfway through and sneezes. The entire table goes quiet. Someone mutters, well, that's the end of that courtship. She sighs, rolls up the scroll, and drops it into a basket labeled unfavored. Yes, that was a real thing. Some couples kept a collection of unfavored letters, notes rejected by sneeze or divine disapproval, a bit like modern breakup boxes but scented with sage and regret. It didn't help that Roman perfume, made from crushed myrtle, rose petals, or even cedar resin, was often used to scent love letters, sometimes too strongly. There's a satirical passage from the poet Catullus mocking a man whose letters caused more sneezes than sighs. Apparently his Eros oil had the same nasal impact as a public bathhouse mop. To avoid this, some lovers began wrapping their letters in olive leaves to ground the scent. Others applied wax thicker than necessary, hoping to trap whatever sneeze-inducing aroma lay inside. One creative suitor even included tiny feather quills to warn the recipient. Open slowly. I come bearing both love and pollen. But perhaps the most bizarre twist was the use of love charms based on sneezing. Yes, people tried to induce sneezing on purpose while reading their own love letters. The idea was to fake or provoke a sneeze, then claim divine endorsement. To the outside world, it was just another sneeze. But to those in the know, it was social sleight of hand. One noblewoman, historically ambiguous but definitely dramatic, is said to have carried powdered pepper in her sleeve. Every time she received a letter, she'd discreetly sniff her cuff, sneeze once, then declare, "Venus herself sends me breath." She married 4 times. Coincidence? There were even sneeze response rituals that lovers were expected to follow. If your intended sneezed upon reading your note, you had to send a reply within a single lunar day, or risk losing the favor of Venus. The reply had to include a blessing back, often something like, "May your winds never be alone," which sounds romantic until you remember it's about nasal turbulence. You round another corner and see an older man selling sneeze-resistant ink. He claims it's made with powdered fig bark and diluted with sacred spring water from Egeria's grotto. Probably just muddy water and goat spit, but hey, it's marketing. One of the side banners reads, "Write your truth without divine misinterpretation." Still, not all love sneeze lore was negative. In rural Roman villages, there was a charming belief that if a girl sneezed while spinning wool, the boy she was thinking about would arrive by sunset. Did it happen often? No. Did that stop spinsters from spending hours sneezing into their yarn? Also no. And in more poetic circles, sneezing was viewed as a kind of emotional honesty. You weren't just reacting to dust, you were having an uncontrollable bodily reaction to intimacy. Lovers would say things like, "He makes my soul sneeze," which is equal parts awkward and adorable. Historians still debate whether all of this was serious belief or just an elaborate series of customs invented by bored romantics. But scrolls don't lie, and neither does the sheer number of sneezes referenced in love letters, graffiti, and surviving romantic poems from the era. The practice even made it into wedding rituals. During Roman marriage ceremonies, the bride was sometimes offered a small pouch of crushed lavender and told, "Hold this until he says he loves you. If you sneeze, the gods have tested his truth." which, when you think about it, was a deeply unscientific way to validate affection. But hey, so is most romance. As the sun begins to dip behind terracotta rooftops, you find yourself surrounded by fluttering scrolls and the quiet tension of letters yet unopened. A young couple sits on a fountain's edge. She opens a scroll, reads silently. Then she sneezes. He looks terrified. She laughs. The tension breaks. They kiss. And just like that, a new superstition is born. Because in ancient Rome, love wasn't just a matter of the heart. It was a matter of the nose. If you sneezed while reading a love letter, the gods might be watching, judging, snickering. So next time you're about to pour your soul into a text or a note, maybe don't wear cologne. And maybe keep a feather nearby, just in case you want Venus to bless you with a sneeze of approval. You duck under an archway, following the laughter of children and the distant clang of metal against stone. The alley's narrow here, giving way to a little-known pocket of Roman life rarely spoken about in textbooks, but impossible to ignore once you hear the stories. The Sneeze Witch trials. Yes, you read that right. There was a time in ancient Rome when sneezing too often, especially in the wrong context or in front of the wrong people, could make you a target of suspicion. Not suspicion of illness, mind you. That would be logical. No, this was far more theatrical. Sneezing too often was interpreted by some as a sign of sorcery. It didn't happen in every district. Rome was too vast, too diverse for a single superstition to rule all hearts and noses. But in certain rural regions and superstitious neighborhoods, especially in the countryside beyond the Servian Wall, it became a sort of folk paranoia, the Sneeze Witch theory. The belief was simple. Some people didn't just sneeze. They caused sneezes. In others, on purpose. If a woman walked into a room and more than 2 people sneezed soon after, eyebrows were raised. If she smiled afterward, that was confirmation. The woman was clearly a breath bender, a sorceress manipulating the air and spiritual winds to curse or charm. One documented case, half myth, half memory, tells of a young woman named Akka from a fishing village near Ostia. She had terrible seasonal allergies. Every spring, she sneezed constantly. She was well liked until one day a group of goats began following her through town, probably because she carried grain in her apron. But people didn't see the grain. They saw the sneezes. The goats. The ominous coincidence. Soon, rumors flew like bees in summer. Akka was accused of summoning animals with her breath, influencing tides with her sniffles, and causing the baker's son to fall in love with his own reflection. She was dragged before a local magistrate who, according to one surviving account, asked if she could sneeze on command. When she couldn't, he took it as proof she was hiding her true power. Now, to be clear, ancient Rome was no Salem. There were no official laws about sneeze witchcraft. You weren't burned or drowned or tested with stones. But local communities, especially those prone to panic or short on logic, made their own judgments. Women like Akka were shunned, forced to wear tokens of wind cleansing, or even offered as unpaid servants to temple kitchens until their spirits calmed. One popular anti-witch item was a clay whistle in the shape of a nose. People would blow it in the direction of someone they suspected of sneeze sorcery. If the person sneezed, it meant they had been exposed. If they didn't, clearly they were resisting exposure, also suspicious. It was a lose-lose situation, a nasal catch-22. The logic, or lack thereof, ran something like this. The gods controlled most omens, but mortals with unnatural control over bodily functions were seen as threatening. And since sneezing was both involuntary and divinely significant, controlling or triggering it meant you were meddling in things best left to Jupiter. Historians still argue whether any of these beliefs trace back to older Roman traditions or were borrowed from other regions like Gaul or early Germanic tribes. Some records suggest the sneeze witch panic peaked during times of plague, when people were already jumpy and looking for any excuse to exile the unlucky. Others think it was a symptom of rural isolation, where weird coincidences were magnified into full-blown legends. Either way, certain signs were considered red flags. Repeated sneezing near water? Sneeze witch. Causing animals to sneeze? Witchcraft. If your sneeze echoed off 3 walls? Very suspicious. And if someone sneezed while you were speaking and then you forgot your next words, well, clearly they'd stolen your voice breath. That last one, voice breath theft, was a particularly dramatic belief held in some mountainous communities. It was said that a sneeze at the right moment could steal your thoughts, like snatching a whisper from the air. People would blame forgotten words, misspoken prayers, even romantic rejection on someone nearby sucking their breath. It's dramatic, it's absurd, and yes, it's very Roman. Back in the city, some temples issued protective sneeze tokens. Small discs of bronze etched with phrases like "Spiritus meus mecum est," "My spirit is with me," which you'd wear around your neck if people began looking at you funny after a sneeze-heavy week. Children weren't exempt either. If a child sneezed too much and showed signs of cleverness or strange dreams, families sometimes called in purifiers, wandering priests who specialized in cleansing the air around households using burning thyme and wind chimes. One account from a village near Campania mentions a boy who sneezed 7 times in a row while reciting his Latin verbs. His teacher claimed he was possessed by clever demons. His mother just blamed the school incense. You pass a small shrine now, one dedicated to Febris, the goddess of fevers. People often left offerings here when they believed an illness was spiritual in origin, especially sneezing-related ones. Grapes, garlic, and tiny clay figurines shaped like noses line the altar. Someone had written a note, "Please take away her loud sneezes, they disturb my husband's dreams." You can almost hear Febris sighing. In larger Roman cities, these beliefs didn't hold as much weight. The educated elite were more likely to mock the idea of sneeze witches, treating them as backwoods superstition. Writers like Pliny scoffed at the idea of someone weaponizing a sneeze. But even Pliny, rational scientific Pliny, once wrote that sneezes ought never be ignored, for even the commonest reflex may be the whisper of the cosmos. So maybe there was a little belief even in the skeptics. And of course, sneeze witch theatre became a genre of its own. Travelling storytellers loved the trope of the young woman whose sneezes could change the weather or seduce the heart of a nobleman. These tales always had the same arc: sneezes, suspicion, exile, dramatic sneeze-saving act, redemption. One particularly famous tale, Lucilla and the East Wind, ends with a sneeze so powerful it blows an evil senator into the Tiber. 10 out of 10. You pause beside an old wall covered in graffiti. Amid the usual vulgar drawings and chicken scratchings, you see the faint outline of a spell. 3 sneezes to draw him near, 1 for passion, 2 for fear. But sneeze at night and mark your fate. Alone you'll sleep, with gods irate. Is it a joke? A warning? A pickup line? In Rome, all 3 were equally possible. It's easy to laugh now. Sneezing as a curse, a theft, a signal of hidden power. But it's also a glimpse into how ancient people tried to make sense of their world. A world full of uncertainty, where invisible forces shaped your fate. A world where the simple act of sneezing could mean your soul was stirred, your thoughts hijacked, or your goats mysteriously enchanted. So the next time you sneeze and someone looks at you sideways, don't be alarmed. Just nod slowly, dramatically. Maybe whisper, "The wind knows." Then walk away before they can ask what that means. You've barely rounded the corner from Febris's shrine when you hear the rhythmic clank of metal on cobblestone, the kind of sound that says a Roman army unit is nearby. Sure enough, a procession of soldiers in dusty sandals and sun-worn cloaks comes into view, marching in tight formation. Their shields glint in the sun, their expressions are solemn, and trailing behind them is a young recruit doing everything in his power not to sneeze. You can see it. The twitch of the nose, the subtle pinching at the bridge. He's holding it in like the fate of the empire depends on it. And in a way, it kind of does. Because when it came to the Roman military, sneezing wasn't just bad manners, it was a breach of protocol. There were actual codes governing sneezing in the army, complete with punishments, workarounds, and, of course, superstitions thick enough to choke on. Let's start with the basics. In the average Roman military encampment, sneezing was treated as both a potential security risk and an interpretive omen. A single sneeze during a night watch could trigger panic if mistaken for a signal. A sneeze during a planning session might be interpreted as Jupiter disapproving of the route. And if someone sneezed while the centurion was giving orders, let's just say it didn't go over well. So, they developed sneeze codes. a series of informal rules and gestures designed to handle the nasal uprising without interrupting military function. There was even a designated gesture. Soldiers were taught to tap their chest twice and raise 2 fingers if they felt a sneeze coming, but managed to hold it in. This meant, "I've neutralized the omen, no need to panic." If someone did sneeze, they were required to immediately say, "Valiant deuces. May the leaders be well." It wasn't an apology, it was insurance. You had to redirect the sneeze's spiritual energy away from command. Think of it as the ancient military version of damage control. Historians still debate whether these rituals were officially taught in training or simply passed down as tradition among soldiers. Some units followed them religiously. Others, especially those stationed far from Rome, developed their own quirky alternatives. One Gallic outpost apparently made all soldiers sneeze into a ceremonial bag carried by the unit's standard bearer. Its purpose? To trap the breath before it reached the gods. You heard that right. The gods, it was believed, could misinterpret a soldier's sneeze as a signal, especially if multiple soldiers sneezed in succession. That's how the silent sneeze salute was born. This technique involved a 3-step process. 1. Clench your jaw. 2. Pinch your nostrils. 3. Strike your thigh once as the sneeze passed. It worked about as well as you'd expect. Most soldiers looked like they were performing interpretive dance, but their officers respected the effort. In the elite Praetorian Guard, things got even more serious. One tale speaks of a young guard named Marius, who sneezed while standing behind Emperor Tiberius. The emperor, famously paranoid, believed the sneeze to be a coded assassination warning. Marius was removed from his post and reassigned to latrine duty outside Baia, essentially the ancient Roman equivalent of being exiled to the most mosquito-infested vacation spot on the peninsula. To prevent such mishaps, Praetorians were given sneeze training. Yes, that was a thing. They learned breathing techniques, mint leaf chewing to suppress irritation, and practiced controlled exhalation to avoid triggering omens. There were even rumors that some guards underwent mild cauterization of the nasal lining to reduce reflex sensitivity. Was it extreme? Sure. But so was guarding an emperor who thought thunderstorms were assassins in disguise. And then there were the field strategies. Before battle, soldiers were expected to perform a sneeze-clearing ritual. They'd gather in a semicircle, inhale incense smoke from juniper or laurel, and loudly declare, "If wind must come, let it come now." After this, a designated moment was given for soldiers to sneeze freely, almost like a rehearsal. If no one sneezed, morale soared. If someone did, particularly from the left side of the circle, the unit might postpone the attack or choose an alternate path. War, after all, was dangerous enough without irritating Jupiter. One scroll fragment from a legionary stationed in Judea contains this weary complaint. "We stood ready at the gates, and Lucanus sneezed. Again. Now we wait 3 days while the augurs decide if his nose lies." You can feel the frustration. Soldiers also carried herb sap satchels, small bundles tied to their belts containing sage, thyme, and chamomile. These weren't for cooking. They were for sniffing when a sneeze tickled the nose mid-march. A good soldier was expected to snuff out a sneeze faster than a fire on a straw roof. Then there's the story of the Battle of the Stolen Sneeze, a nickname historians gave to an absurd but well-documented skirmish near the Danube frontier. The general leading the charge, Decimus Junius Brutus, was delivering orders when a scout sneezed, twice. The general halted everything. Troops were instructed to make offerings to the local river deity. In the delay, the enemy army moved. When the Romans finally attacked, they found the camp empty. The general blamed the scout's sneeze. The scout blamed the pollen. The historians blame both. Sneezing could even influence promotion. One aspiring officer in Hispania was denied advancement after being dubbed the Sneezer by his peers. He claimed he just had a sensitivity to pine dust. His centurion claimed Jupiter was trying to warn the ranks through him, and that no man favored by omens would sneeze so often. You pause by a military memorial now, one of those old stone columns inscribed with names of the fallen. Someone scratched into the base. He sneezed before the charge. We charged anyway. There's a quiet reverence in those words, maybe even regret. But it wasn't all dread and superstition. Some soldiers viewed sneezing as a sign of divine approval, especially if it happened right after praying for victory. In those cases, the sneeze was seen as an answer, a yes from the heavens. Entire legions might shout "Salve" in unison after such a sneeze, raising their swords like they were toasting the god of thunder. And yes, some units got creative. One battalion, known as the Cohors Ventorum, the Wind Cohort, held yearly contests for the most well-timed sneeze. If you sneezed exactly as the horn blew to begin a drill, you got an extra wine ration. Their mascot? A bronze nose with wings. As silly as it all sounds, these rituals brought soldiers together. They gave meaning to involuntary moments. They created a shared culture where every sniffle could be a story, every wheeze a whispered warning. Even the toughest warriors need something to believe in. You follow the column of soldiers now as they continue down the path, their boots thudding in rhythm. The young recruit finally sneezes, quietly into his tunic. No one reacts. He taps his chest twice, raises 2 fingers, and keeps walking. He did it right. And in Rome, that might be all it takes to survive the gods' judgment. You drift away from the dusty column of marching soldiers, stepping into the quieter shade of a temple courtyard, where the air shifts from heat and tension to incense and murmured prayer. It's cool here, hushed, with worn marble underfoot and a statue of Minerva peering down from her pedestal, her eyes forever carved into a stern squint. You inhale, the scent of burning myrrh filling your nose, and almost sneeze. But you stop yourself, because here, in this sacred space, a sneeze means something far more complicated. Welcome to the world of temple sneeze offerings. In ancient Rome, sneezing within a temple wasn't just permissible, it could be deeply significant. But the rules were specific, ritualized, and, as usual, wildly inconsistent from one god to another. You couldn't just walk into the temple of Saturn, sneeze, and hope for blessings. That would be, at best, confusing to the priests, and, at worst, a fast track to being side-eyed for the rest of your spiritual life. Instead, temples had coded interpretations for when and how sneezing occurred. Each deity had their own guidelines. A sneeze in the presence of Jupiter Optimus Maximus, considered a direct nod from the heavens. Priests would halt the rite, declare the sneeze sacred, and sometimes even invite the sneezer to approach the altar and place their hand on the sacred fire basin, just in case their breath had carried divine instructions. But sneeze in Minerva's temple? Not so fast. She was the goddess of wisdom and precision. Sneezing in her sanctuary could be interpreted as an intellectual disruption, a sign your thoughts had been scattered. One poor scholar reportedly sneezed during a recitation of Virgil and was made to spend 2 days in silence to let the mind settle. And if you were foolish enough to sneeze during a sacrifice? Oh no. During active sacrifice rituals, like the burning of grain, the anointing of a statue, or the pouring of sacred wine, a sneeze was often seen as an interruption by the gods, usually to signal disapproval. The ritual would stop immediately, and priests would consult the augurs. In extreme cases, the entire offering had to be repeated, with new animals, fresh firewood, and cleaner tunics. You can imagine how well that went over with the temple accountants. Historians still argue whether these sneeze protocols were developed by priests as genuine spiritual procedures or as clever tools of crowd control. Either way, they worked. People watched their noses in temples like their souls depended on it. Now, here's where it gets even more Roman. Temples had sneeze thresholds, literally marked zones where sneezing meant different things. Step 1 foot inside the outer peristyle and sneeze? Good luck, especially if facing east. Sneeze just inside the vestibule? Neutral, unless the wind carried the sound toward the altar. Sneeze while touching the altar itself? Potential crisis, depending on which god was watching. Some temples even had sneeze altars, small side shrines where you could pre-sneeze or direct your impending sneeze respectfully. You'd turn your head toward the altar, raise your hand in a half salute, sneeze softly, and then whisper a short blessing. Spiritus exeo, gratia maniat. May the spirit depart, but grace remain. And yes, there were offerings for sneezes. If you sneezed in a temple, intentionally or not, you were often expected to leave something behind to seal the air. Common sneeze offerings included a loaf of bread, especially round loaves that symbolized the cycle of breath, a clay figure of a nose, handmade and left beside the steps, a handful of dried lavender tied in red thread. Or, for the wealthy, a small silver coin inscribed with the word vale. But here's the odd twist. These offerings were only expected if the sneeze occurred on your third visit to the temple. Not the first, not the second, just the third. The idea was that 3 visits marked a spiritual settling in, and so the third sneeze was a sign you had spiritually connected and now owed something back. You step farther in now, past the columns into the inner sanctum, where a priest in a sun-bleached robe carefully arranges flowers near the altar of Venus Genetrix. She glances at a woman who sneezes, once lightly while laying down roses. The priest pauses, then says gently, "The gods have heard your heart. Leave your second bloom." This too was a ritual, second bloom surrender. If a woman sneezed while making an offering of flowers, she was expected to remove the second most beautiful bloom and set it aside as a separate gift, one for herself and one for the goddess. It was thought to reflect balance, divine favor without arrogance. And not all sneeze offerings were spontaneous. Some were planned. People would enter the temple hoping to sneeze, believing that if they could trigger a sneeze within sacred space, it would mean the god was listening through them. They'd rub their noses with mint, inhale incense, or bring along dried poppy pods, hoping to coax a sneeze at just the right moment. One temple even had a servant whose job was to wave basil branches near people's faces while they prayed. And of course, there were always skeptics. One story tells of a priest in the Temple of Mars who sneezed mid-sermon and used it to dramatically pause, look skyward, and announce that Mars had disagreed with the emperor's new war tax. He was later reassigned to goat-watching duties outside Vesuvius. Still, even the skeptical couldn't ignore how deeply temple sneeze etiquette was embedded into Roman consciousness. It wasn't just about superstition, it was about being seen as someone who respected the gods enough to care where and how their breath left their body. Children were taught to cup their hands near the temples and hold their breath if they felt a sneeze coming. Elderly women carried small embroidered cloths kissed with holy oil, just for the possibility of a temple sneeze. And in the markets, vendors sold sneeze offerings in a box, tiny bundles pre-wrapped with herbs, a wax nose charm, and a short written prayer, just in case, they'd say. Historians still debate whether the obsession with temple sneezing was truly about spiritual reverence, or if it became a form of social currency. Sneeze at the right time in the right place, and people might see you as blessed, chosen, special. Sneeze wrong, you were careless, irreverent, unlucky. You sit now on the cool edge of a fountain in the temple courtyard, watching a pigeon flap its wings. A boy beside you sneezes once. His father gently presses a dried olive leaf into his hand and murmurs, "For fortuna, for breath, for the next time." And it's moments like this that remind you, to the Romans, the sneeze wasn't just noise. It was breath meeting belief, wind meeting worship, a whisper of the soul brushing against the marble edge of eternity. So if you ever find yourself standing in a place where the air feels heavier, the light softer, and your nose starts to twitch, be careful where you sneeze. The gods might be listening. The air thickens with incense as you leave the temple grounds behind, your mind still lingering on the image of tiny wax nose charms and reverent handkerchiefs soaked in sacred oil. But you don't get far, because just around the corner, marble columns give way to a much rowdier scene, a Senate session in full swing. You catch the echo of raised voices first, sharp, theatrical Latin bouncing off stone walls like an operatic argument. Senators in flowing togas gesturing with both hands and eyes, locked in a battle of metaphors and amendments. And then, as if summoned by divine cue, achoo! A single sneeze cracks through the tension like a whip. Immediately, the room falls silent. A moment later, the presiding magistrate clears his throat and says solemnly, "Noted. The gods have spoken. This floor is now paused. Yes, this is real." In ancient Rome, a sneeze in the Senate chamber could halt the proceedings. Not out of politeness, but out of cosmic caution. It's easy to forget that Rome, for all its laws and marble gravitas, was still built on a thick foundation of omens. And nowhere was that tension between policy and superstition more visible than in the Curia Julia, the Senate house itself. While senators debated taxation, war, and citizenship, They also had to contend with thunder, bird flight patterns, and yes, sneezing. So when a senator sneezed, especially during a speech or right before a vote, the whole process could be interrupted, delayed, or even discarded entirely. This wasn't optional. These interruptions were part of Roman tradition. After all, if Jupiter chose that moment to breathe through someone's face, maybe it was time to reconsider that grain import bill. Historians still argue whether these interruptions were originally religious or if they evolved into a kind of procedural loophole, a way to stall decisions without directly opposing powerful colleagues. Because let's be honest, if you wanted to delay a vote but couldn't say so out loud, sneezing was a clever workaround. Some senators took it to absurd levels. One man, Gnaeus Pompilius, became famous, or infamous, for allegedly faking 19 sneezes in a single session to delay debate on a new military tax. He'd sniff pepper, wave scrolls in front of his face, even chew mint and glare dramatically at Jupiter's statue in the corner. His colleagues caught on eventually, and his antics were officially called the Lex Sternutationis Pompiliana, the Pompilius sneeze law, unofficial of course, but still referenced in jokes for decades. Others weren't faking. Some senators had legitimate allergies or nervous sneezes brought on by stress. There was a phrase for it, sternutatio consularis, meaning consul's sneeze. It was viewed as a mix of weakness and divine burden. If you were prone to public sneezing, you had to carry a small vow scroll with you at all times, already filled out, in case you needed to immediately appease the gods with a written pledge. And yes, the direction of the sneeze mattered here too. A sneeze to the right while speaking was considered affirmation from the gods. Your words were blessed. The audience would murmur, "Bene," and you might even get applause. A sneeze to the left? Oh dear. That meant you were either lying, cursed, or worse, boring. The debate could be stopped and referred to augurs for divine clarification. A sneeze from the back of the chamber? That was interpreted as public disapproval, not divine. An audience member reacting badly. You were expected to acknowledge it, just like a heckler today. If two senators sneezed at the same time, the issue at hand was often immediately postponed. This was known as a concordant expulsion, seen as a sign the gods were deliberating amongst themselves and preferred mortals not to interfere. Votes would be rescheduled, the room would be cleared, incense burned, and you, having waited 3 hours for a tax update, would simply have to come back tomorrow. To avoid excessive delays, the Senate adopted a set of sneeze response protocols, essentially a polite script for acknowledging the interruption. 1. If someone sneezed during another's speech, they were expected to raise one hand and say, "Valeamus omnes, may we all be well." 2. The speaker would then nod and continue, unless the sneeze was particularly loud or oddly timed, in which case they'd pause and look to the augurs seated nearby for approval. 3. If 2 or more senators sneezed, everything stopped and the presiding official would declare, "The voice of the gods is upon us." And that was that. But just like in any bureaucracy, some people gamed the system. It became fashionable for some senators to keep pepper sachets hidden in their sleeves. A light sniff, a well-timed sneeze, and boom, you could halt a rival's momentum mid-argument. Entire sessions were lost to these games. Some senators were accused of hiring sternutators, professional sneezers, who would sit in the gallery and time their nasal eruptions to disrupt unpopular proposals. Eventually, this led to the introduction of sneeze seating zones, segregated areas of the chamber where known sneezy individuals had to sit, far from the central orator. Did it work? Sometimes. Did it spark endless debate about fairness, discrimination, and bodily autonomy? Absolutely. Roman politics, always ahead of its time and behind at the same time. One famous case involved a proposal to divert water from a sacred spring to feed public baths. The debate was heated. A well-respected senator rose to speak in favor of the measure, and just as he began, 3 consecutive sneezes rang out from the leftmost wall. He stopped, nodded grimly, and said, "The gods oppose this. I yield." The proposal failed. A week later, Rome endured a rare drought. Coincidence, perhaps, or maybe the gods had stronger lungs than anyone expected. Sometimes sneezing could even save reputations. There's a recorded instance where a senator, caught in a lie during testimony, sneezed before he could finish his sentence. The augur present declared it a sign of divine interruption, that the gods would not allow a falsehood to proceed. The man was spared punishment. People whispered afterward that he owed Jupiter a very large chicken. And in the rarest, most dramatic moments, a sneeze could end a session completely. If someone sneezed during a vote, especially the deciding vote on a major issue, it was considered unclean energy contaminating the outcome. The vote would be scratched, the room cleared, and new voting schedules drawn. Some senators started bringing lavender bundles to rub under their noses before voting, meant to purify the passageway of fate. Historians still debate whether this obsession with sneezing in the Senate was genuinely about divine signs or just a sophisticated way to dodge accountability. It's hard to say, but the records are there, carved in marble and scroll alike, reminding us that in Rome, even legislation bowed to the sniffles of fate. As you stand quietly at the edge of the Curia, the debate resumes. A senator raises a hand, says something about tariffs on Sicilian grain, and then sneezes. He pauses. Everyone stares. The magistrate sighs. The gods are reviewing the matter. And with that, another session stalls. So the next time you sneeze during a meeting, remember, in ancient Rome, that might have been enough to rewrite a law, stop a war, or at the very least, earn you a free roasted chicken and a polite applause. You step away from the Senate hall, its marble silence echoing with 100 unspoken sneezes and postponed decisions, and head toward the busy heart of the forum. The stone beneath your sandals is warm from the midday sun, and around you, vendors call out prices in practiced rhythms. Women in linen tunics shuffle past with baskets of olives and cheese, and children dart through the crowd, giggling as they try to trip one another up with stray fennel stalks. It's here, among the hustle of everyday life, that one of the strangest sneeze traditions took root, the love sneeze test. No temples, no senators, just glances, gossip, and the occasional nasal explosion. This was the rule. If you sneezed while looking at someone, it meant you were attracted to them. Not in a subtle, polite way. No. The gods had supposedly overridden your restraint and sent a gust of divine truth hurtling out of your face. It was called signum affectionis subito, the sign of sudden affection. In other words, sneeze at someone and everyone around you assumed you were halfway to proposing. Now imagine the chaos this caused in a city with dust, pollen, and more perfume than scents. People sneezed constantly, especially in the crowded market stalls where love sneeze interpretations were most frequent. Say you're buying figs. The merchant's son is unusually handsome. You glance up, he glances back, and boom, a coup! A second later, his mother is shouting across the stall, "Juno smiles, he likes you!" And you're awkwardly laughing, wondering whether to pretend it was allergies or start asking about wedding dowries. This tradition was particularly powerful among young lovers, who viewed the sneeze as a kind of love lottery. If you sneezed in someone's presence and they sneezed shortly after, within the same hour, day, or in more dramatic retellings, the same breath, you were said to be fated for each other. It was called a duplex amoris, a double sneeze of love. Historians still argue about where this tradition originated. Some trace it to ancient fertility rituals, where the breath was viewed as a sacred connection between souls. Others think it was simply a romantic interpretation of happenstance. Because, let's face it, sneezing while staring at someone happens more often than you'd think, and humans have always been desperate to make meaning from it. Rome, of course, took it a step further. Some communities kept love sneeze logs, literal ledgers where sneezes were documented and timed. If two people had enough aligned sneezes in the same market or temple, neighbors would start nudging them toward each other. One such log was found scratched into the wall of a bakery, reading, "Aulus sneezed near Flavia 3 times in 1 week. Wedding soon?" Even the poets got in on it. One minor bard, Tibullus the Younger, wrote, "She sneezed once, then twice. I sneezed back in kind. The gods arranged our breath, so let our hearts entwine." Sure, it's cheesy, but in a city where omens were everywhere, love sneezes offered a light-hearted counterbalance to all the gloom and doom of curses and bad harvests. You walk now through a quieter corner of the forum, past a shaded colonnade where a group of teenagers sit tossing pebbles and whispering. You hear one of them ask, "Did she sneeze when you said her name?" The other nods solemnly. Everyone gasps, because saying someone's name and making them sneeze, even from a distance, was considered the ultimate test of romantic connection. If it happened, it meant your souls were windbound, connected by invisible breath across space. This was usually followed by shy glances, swooning, or, in one case recorded by the historian Suetonius, a broken engagement because the intended didn't sneeze at the right moment. Not all reactions were positive. Some believed that sneezing during courtship was a warning. If you sneezed just as someone said something flattering, it meant they were lying. The breath from your lungs was literally rejecting their falsehood. If they sneezed as they handed you a gift, it was a sign the gift came with strings attached. There was even a saying, "He who sneezes while offering figs offers figments." If both parties sneezed at the exact same time during a conversation, that was either a sign of shared destiny or divine mockery. People would often consult a priest, augur, or very opinionated aunt to interpret the meaning. And just like everything else, there were accessories to support the love sneeze theory. Sellers in the forum hawked items like amor noses, tiny carved charms in the shape of noses, given as courting gifts. Scented scrolls, filled with poems laced with sneeze-inducing herbs, meant to provoke a spontaneous sneeze when read aloud by a potential lover. Red threads, worn behind the ear to encourage divine breath alignment, essentially romantic talismans that helped catch your heart's twin sneeze. You passed by a graffiti wall, likely scribbled by teens. One carving says, "Tullia sneezed as I looked. I am doomed and delighted." Another says, "She did not sneeze. The gods are cruel." And tucked between them, the romantic realist, "She sneezed, then walked away. It meant nothing. My nose lies." Some skeptics, especially older men, rolled their eyes at this whole phenomenon. Pliny the Elder called love sneezes the childish flutterings of soft minds. He believed true love was built on logic, land, and legacies, not shared wind. That said, he also documented a case where a couple reportedly sneezed in unison every morning for 20 years. Whether this was affection, routine, or shared allergies, we'll never know. Historians still debate whether these sneeze beliefs were real, exaggerated, or symbolic. But they had real social consequences. People watched, waited, and interpreted. Some couples claimed to have first known they were destined for one another not through eye contact or touch, but through that oddly satisfying, awkward jolt of a shared sneeze. And sometimes, a sneeze was the first move. In a tavern off the Via Sacra, lovers would sit facing each other, sipping wine steeped with saffron, and wait. If one of them sneezed while looking into the other's eyes and the other blessed them without breaking eye contact, it was said their fates had been sealed. The ritual was called oculis sternutatio, sneeze through the eyes. Sound ridiculous? Of course. That's why it was perfect for Rome. And then, of course, came the wedding sneeze rites. Couples were often given bundles of fresh herbs, basil, thyme, and fennel to carry during the ceremony. If either partner sneezed as they exchanged vows, it was considered a gift from Venus, a breath of love sent from above. But if they both sneezed at the same time, the ceremony paused. Not cancelled, just paused. A priest would step in, say a quick prayer, and offer a small honey cake to seal the winds before continuing. If you didn't sneeze at all during your wedding, that was fine. But people would watch and comment and speculate. You walk past one such ceremony now, an older couple renewing vows. The man sneezes softly as he lifts his wife's veil. She laughs, touches his cheek, and murmurs something you don't catch. But the priest smiles, and that's the beauty of it all. Because for a culture so deeply invested in omens, curses, and divine warnings, the love sneeze was something else entirely, a little flicker of hope, a reason to smile, proof that even the gods appreciated a bit of awkward romance. So next time someone sneezes while you're flirting, or you sneeze while thinking about someone, maybe don't brush it off. Maybe, just maybe, the wind knows what your heart's still figuring out. You're drifting through the winding streets now, full of warm bread smells and the murmur of midday rest, when you pass a courtroom tucked between two government buildings. It's a modest structure, no towering statues or golden rooftops, just columns, benches, and the faint sense of tension that always comes when truth is on trial. Inside, a crowd gathers, not for scandal, but for something more Roman than marble itself, a sneeze during testimony. Yes, in ancient Rome, if someone sneezed during a trial, it wasn't just ignored or politely blessed, it could alter the direction of justice itself. You push through the door and find a trial already underway. A merchant stands nervously at the front, arms folded in the stiff way only the truly guilty or extremely cold do. He's mid-sentence when someone in the audience sneezes, once loudly. Immediately, the room goes quiet. The judge looks toward the noise, nods slowly, and mutters, "Numen intervenit." The spirit has intervened. Because in this world, in this court, a sneeze during a trial was no small thing. It was a divine interjection, a cosmic red flag. And depending on the timing, intensity, and direction, it might be interpreted as evidence, or at least as a sign that the gods' gods were watching more closely than usual. Now, to be fair, Roman courts did not rely solely on sneezes for verdicts. They had procedures, laws, magistrates, and plenty of shouting. But like so many things in Rome, law and religion were deeply entangled. You couldn't separate fate from fact, not entirely. So a sneeze could tip the scales. Let's break down how it worked. If a witness sneezed during testimony, it could be taken as affirmation if it happened while telling a consistent story, suspicion if it occurred mid-lie or immediately after being questioned, divine pause if the sneeze came just before delivering a major piece of information. In the latter case, the judge might halt the testimony and consult an augur, a religious official trained in interpreting signs. The augur would ask questions like, did the sneeze come from the right? Was it echoed? Did birds respond? Was there a shadow at the time? You can imagine how long this made the legal process. Historians still debate whether the sneeze influence was more symbolic or whether it genuinely impacted outcomes. But scrolls and case fragments suggest that at the very least, trials were frequently delayed or reopened after sneezes occurred. One famous case involved a baker accused of watering down wine, a common and terrible crime in Rome. During his defense, he claimed he'd never cheated a customer. As he finished speaking, the prosecutor sneezed violently. The judge paused and said, "Jupiter interrupts. Speak again." The baker repeated himself. The prosecutor sneezed again. Trial paused. A fresh priest was brought in. The baker lost the case. Now, could that prosecutor have had a pepper satchel hidden under his toga? Absolutely. And that's the sneaky side of this tradition, because of course people weaponized the sneeze. There were accounts of people bringing professional sneeze disruptors to court, much like those hired to distract senators. These individuals, called sternutatoris forensis, would position themselves in the gallery and, at key moments, trigger carefully timed sneezes to suggest divine intervention. Were they effective? Sometimes. But the judges eventually caught on, and sneeze interpreting was elevated to a formal role. Some trials even had sacred auditors, individuals trained to detect genuine divine sneezes from fakes. Criteria included nasal tone, timing, breath rhythm, and even a sniff test. That's right, somebody's whole job was to smell a sneeze and judge its authenticity. You hear a sharp sneeze erupt in the corner of the courtroom. Everyone turns. A man raises both hands and says, "It was pepper, I swear!" Everyone laughs, but the judge still scribbles something down. Because humor or not, the sneeze was recorded. Court scribes kept logs that included number of sneezes, who sneezed, where the sneeze occurred, near the witness, near the accused, from the gallery, time of day, direction of wind, if applicable. These sneeze notations were reviewed alongside regular testimony, especially in cases of moral ambiguity, where hard evidence was lacking and divine signs were considered helpful. And the sneeze wasn't only taken seriously in criminal trials. In civil suits, particularly those involving property or inheritance, a sneeze could shift blame, delay signing of documents, or cause entire agreements to be rewritten. There's a case recorded in Pompeii where two brothers disputed ownership of a vineyard. As the older brother laid out his case, a pigeon flew overhead and the younger brother sneezed. The judge stood bowed slightly toward the altar in the room and said, "This is no longer about grapes. This is about truth. The case was paused for 8 days, and the vineyard was eventually divided evenly. The reasoning? The gods gave breath to both. And yes, sneezing could also be used in duels of honor. If someone challenged you to a legal duel, essentially a formal fight to settle a case, you could request a pre-duel sneeze test. You and your opponent would face each other. Incense was waved. If either man sneezed, the gods were said to have taken their side. Sometimes the duel would be called off right then and there. Other times it would proceed, but everyone would know that fate had picked its favorite. You pass by a group of lawyers now, huddled under an awning, sipping watered wine and arguing about a recent ruling. One of them says, if he hadn't sneezed, they never would have believed him. Another scoffs, he sneezed because he was lying. The first replies, no, he sneezed because Mars agrees with his land claim. It's nonsense. It's brilliant. It's Rome. And even outside formal courtrooms, the idea of trial sneezes entered public life. In debates, family arguments, even merchant disputes, someone might shout, the gods affirm, after a sneeze and consider the issue resolved. If no one sneezed, the argument could drag on for days. One satirical poem describes a husband and wife arguing about whether to buy a new mule. When the husband sneezed mid-complaint, the wife kissed him and said, you win. The gods think I'm being stubborn. Historians still debate how seriously these traditions were taken by legal scholars versus the common public. But even Cicero himself, master of rhetoric and law, once remarked, there are lies, statistics, and sneezes. Only one of them may be trusted by the divine. And that's really the heart of it. Because in a world without surveillance cameras or voice recordings, where honor, persuasion, and interpretation carried the day, the sneeze became a kind of wild card, a sacred unpredictability injected into human systems of control. A reminder that no matter how well you argued, how much land you owned, how cleverly your lawyer spoke, the gods could still step in uninvited through someone's sinuses. So next time you sneeze in a courtroom, or a job interview, or a big moment, don't panic. Just raise a hand, nod with confidence, and whisper, valiant deuces. You might just win the case. You leave the courtroom behind, head spinning from sneeze-led trials and feather-waving augurs, and wander back toward the open marketplace. But as you stroll past the painted shop signs and fruit-stacked carts, a different kind of performance catches your attention. Street vendors shouting not just for attention, but for sneezes. One cries, blessings to the beautiful who walk by, while another bellows, sneezed lately? Come try my figs. Jupiter approves. It's not just salesmanship, it's strategy. Because in the twisting lanes of Rome's commercial heart, sneezing became more than just an omen or social quirk. It became a form of marketing. This is the curious story of how street vendors weaponized the sneeze for profit. It might sound ridiculous, but here's how it worked. Romans believed sneezes were signs. Everyone from philosophers to bakers said so. And if the gods could interrupt a Senate vote or a wedding vow, surely they could weigh in on papyrus scrolls, leather sandals, spiced lentils? Of course they could. So enterprising merchants began to incorporate sneezing into their sales tactics. The moment someone sneezed, whether naturally or from a well-placed whiff of pepper, vendors would shout a blessing in hopes of attracting the sneezer's attention and making a quick sale. It was called blessing baiting. The idea was simple. If someone just had a divine gust exit their face, they were more open to suggestion. The gods had spoken through them. Now was the time to strike. Sneezing placed the buyer in a heightened spiritual state, or so vendors claimed. You weren't just buying garum, you were fulfilling fate. Historians still argue whether this belief was sincerely held or just clever manipulation, likely both. But the sneeze became part of the performance of persuasion, especially in crowded markets where attention was the most valuable currency. Some vendors took things even further. They developed elaborate, sneeze-catching phrases designed to both bless and sell. You'd hear, "A cue! Jupiter says my dates are sweeter." You sneezed, that means fate brought you to this stall. 3 sneezes today? That's a sign, buy 3 of anything and get 1 free. And people responded. Not always by buying something, but often with a laugh, a nod, or at least a moment of eye contact, which was usually all the vendor needed to reel them in. Others used props. One baker hung dried mint bundles near his bread, so the smell would provoke sneezes as people walked by. If you sneezed, he'd hand you a roll and say, "You've earned it, the gods are hungry too." You take a bite of one now, slightly stale, overly salted, but wrapped in ritual. And it wasn't just food vendors who adopted the practice. A scroll seller near the Tiber became known for sprinkling powdered saffron on his wares. If someone sneezed while browsing, he'd say, "That poem speaks to your soul. Buy it before your fate moves on." It worked often enough that he never stopped. This led to an entire class of sternutarii, professional sneeze interpreters who roamed the market offering to read your sneeze and recommend a purchase that matched the omen. You'd sneeze, they'd squint at the sun, feel the breeze touch your wrist and say something like, "That sneeze was short and sharp. Mars favors strength. You need a new sword belt." Or, your sneeze bent leftward on a south wind. You're meant to buy figs and write a letter to your uncle. Ridiculous? Absolutely. Did people still pay for the advice? Also, yes. There were rules, of course. If a sneeze came from the left while you were holding an item, it meant the item should not be purchased. It had rejected you. But if the sneeze came from the right, it was a blessing. The item was yours, divinely approved. Some merchants trained assistants to stand on either side of potential buyers and, at key moments, sneeze on command. Left for unwanted items, right for the stuff they wanted to sell. Subtle? Not at all. Effective? You bet. One leather sandal shop kept a trained monkey who would sneeze on cue, either genuinely or by rubbing his nose with sage leaves. The monkey sat near the sandal racks, and whichever sandal he sneezed closest to became the chosen pair. Customers lined up daily just for the experience. He had a name, Sternutius Maximus. And yes, competitions emerged. Vendors began vying for the most effective sneeze slogan, the most outrageous sneeze stunt, the best sneeze detection trick. The Sternutation Festival, held annually during late summer, turned into a wild market fair of pepper dust, scented candles, competitive sneezing games, and blessing carts offering holy sneezed-upon fruit. One year, a vendor built a fake shrine to Sneesia, the goddess of commercial breath. Pilgrims would leave offerings, mostly coins or herbs, and receive a small token, a blessed pepper bean, meant to provoke a sneeze and align your spending with destiny. He made a fortune. No one could prove Sneesia didn't exist. Historians still debate whether this commodification of sneeze culture was frowned upon by temple authorities. Some priests were annoyed, believing it profaned the sacred signals of the gods. Others saw it as harmless and sometimes even joined in, offering official blessings for extra coin. A few vendors were caught faking sneeze omens. One stall had a small bellows hidden under the counter, releasing cinnamon powder into the air to trigger passing sneezes. When discovered, he defended himself by saying, "The gods love a good nudge." He was fined a modest amount and went right back to selling apples the next day. You walk through the market now and hear a vendor shout, "Ah, you sneezed at the olives. That means you've been chosen. 6 for a denarius." Another waves a fan toward your face and says, "I sense a sneeze coming. Don't resist it. It's how the gods clear your doubts." It's absurd. It's brilliant. It's Rome. But it wasn't always about manipulation. For many vendors, sneeze traditions were genuinely part of daily ritual. Before opening shop, some would perform small clearing rites, sniffing lavender or mint and sneezing into a cloth, then hanging it above the stall to release stagnant fortune. Others would keep logs of the number of sneezes that occurred each day, treating high sneeze counts as signs of favorable energy and low counts as cause for cautious pricing. One fishmonger even tied a piece of chalk to his sneeze rag and marked each time someone sneezed near his stall. If the number reached 7 by noon, he'd offer discounts, claiming that 7 sneezes meant Neptune approved of his catch. And perhaps the most heartwarming tale is of an old weaver who gave a discount to anyone who sneezed while admiring her fabric. Her reasoning: if it moves your nose, it must move your heart. She died with a modest fortune and an entire alley named after her, Vicus Sternutationis, Sneeze Lane. Because at its heart, the sneeze in Roman commerce wasn't just a gimmick. It was a tiny mystery, a pause, a moment when something involuntary, unpredictable, and oddly personal entered the public space, And people chose to see it as an invitation, to buy, to bless, to connect. So the next time you're in a market, modern or ancient, and someone sneezes behind you, maybe don't just mumble, "Bless you," and walk away. Maybe turn, look, smile, and whisper, "You've been chosen. Would you like to buy something?" The streets begin to quiet now, shadows lengthening as the Roman sun dips lower in the sky, casting a golden sheen across clay rooftops and worn marble. But the wind picks up, just a little. Enough to make the linen togas rustle and the dust rise again. Enough to tickle a nose or two. And that's when you notice something peculiar. A group of priests in long red robes and laurel crowns parading slowly through a street, each holding a bundle of garlic and a small feather fan. Their destination? A bustling plaza where people are lining up, children squirming with excitement, older folks standing patiently with sprigs of mint tucked behind their ears. You've stumbled into something strange. Welcome to the Sneeze Festival, or as it was properly known, Festum Sternutationis. Yes, there was a festival in ancient Rome dedicated to sneezing. It wasn't one of the major holidays like Saturnalia or Lupercalia, and it wasn't officially sanctioned by the Senate or any particular temple. But it existed, celebrated especially in the outer districts and countryside where folklore thrived. It was a seasonal event, held during the time of the garlic harvest, a time when the air was thick with pollen, the roads dusty, and the breeze carried just enough mischief to ensure plenty of public sneezing. The core belief? That sneezing during the garlic season was a sign of purification, the body ridding itself not only of irritants, but also of bad omens, false memories, and spiritual blockage. In other words, sneezing could clean your soul. But the Romans, ever creative, didn't stop at symbolism. They turned it into sport. The Sneeze Festival featured competitions such as the longest delay, who could resist sneezing the longest while feathers were waved under their nose. Some contestants pinched their noses shut, others held their breath. One farmer was reportedly disqualified for fainting. The loudest sneeze, a judged contest where people stood on stone platforms and sneezed with dramatic flair. Bonus points were given if you made a senator jump or knocked over a fruit stand. The most prophetic sneeze. Participants would sneeze into a sacred bowl filled with garlic steam, and then have their sneezes interpreted by local augurs, who would assign fortunes based on the curve, echo, and emotional undertones. It sounds absurd, but there was ritual behind the revelry. The festival opened with a parade of blessings, where people would walk in procession holding sneeze-inducing herbs like basil, sage, and thyme. Musicians played nasal-sounding flutes, yes, really, and children threw powdered rosemary into the air to tempt the gods into tickling. And at the center of the parade was always a large garlic cart, crowned with a statue of a nose carved from wood or clay, called the spiritus caput, or head of breath. Once the cart arrived at the central plaza, it was circled 9 times, and with each pass a priest would shout, "May your breath be honest," a phrase that meant both, "May your sneeze be sincere," and "May your intentions be clear." Classic Roman double meanings. Historians still argue whether this festival had Greek origins, possibly tied to cleansing rituals at the Temple of Asclepius, or if it developed independently among rural Roman families who needed something light-hearted between planting and harvest seasons. The best part? The food. Every sneeze festival included the Great Garlic Feast, where people brought dishes seasoned so heavily with garlic, pepper, and vinegar that just standing near the tables could make your eyes water. The goal was simple: induce a communal sneeze. If everyone at the table sneezed within a minute of one another, it was considered a sign of village unity. People would raise their cups, shout salve, and toast the shared wind. If someone didn't sneeze, they had to wear a necklace of onions until sundown, symbolizing their resistance to the breath of truth. You wander past one such feast now, long wooden tables sagging under the weight of garlic bread, stuffed olives, pickled radish, and a dish called Pumentum sternutarium, or sneeze porridge, made from mashed chickpeas, honey, and enough mustard seed to make your nose rebel. The people around you aren't sneezing by accident. They're savoring it, leaning into the tickle, laughing, blessing one another, even sneezing in choreographed duets. And yes, couples use the festival to test their fates. One tradition, known as the wind bond, required couples to sit side by side under a garland of thyme and wait to see if either would sneeze. If one person sneezed and the other didn't bless them, it was a sign of incompatibility. If both sneezed within a short span, it was considered divine alignment. If neither sneezed, the relationship was said to be too dry, like bread without oil. People wrote poems about it. One scrap from a lost playwright reads, "She sneezed at my laugh, I sneezed at her sigh, and in that duet the gods drew us nigh." The finale of the festival was always the Great Garlic Parade, where the spiritus caput was loaded onto a cart and paraded out of town while people waved cloths soaked in vinegar and oil. It was symbolic, sending the spirits of the old season away, carried on the breath of those who'd sneezed the most. It wasn't a solemn ritual. People danced. They shouted fake sneezes in unison. Teenagers tried to out-sneeze each other with pepper-dipped feathers. Elders watched from balconies, smiling, nodding, maybe sneezing into their sleeves and whispering private blessings. One year, an entire town recorded 312 sneezes in one day, a record carved into a local stone with a simple inscription, "May the breath be ever among us." Historians still debate whether the sneeze festival spread beyond Italy. There are faint traces of similar rituals in parts of Gaul and Hispania, but none with the same theatricality or obsession with feathers. It remains unmistakably a Roman thing, equal parts piety, parody, and party. And despite the absurdity, there's something comforting about it. After all, the sneeze is universal. Everyone does it. No class, no rank, no age escapes it. In a society built on hierarchy and control, the sneeze became a kind of equalizer, a reminder that even a consul might double over mid-sentence and blast a holy gust into the air. So once a year, the Romans let go of decorum. They sneezed openly, joyfully, without fear of judgment or omen. They blessed each other. They honored the ridiculous. They let their breath mean something more than just a biological function. And maybe, just maybe, they found something sacred in the silly. You take a seat now beside a garlic cart, wipe your nose with a cloth offered by a passing child, and exhale through your nose slowly, waiting. A tickle rises. And when it finally comes, loud, involuntary, and utterly glorious, someone nearby claps and shouts, "Fortune favors your lungs." You laugh, and for the first time in hours, feel the weight of superstition lift into something simpler. Air, joy, release. Sometimes that's all a festival needs. The garlic-laced breeze from the festival still clings to your clothes as you follow the winding stone road away from the plaza. Roman lamps flicker to life around you, glowing orange in the dusk, while the voices of merchants and laughing children fade behind shuttered stalls. But up ahead, on the Palatine Hill, you hear a different sort of noise. Something more rigid, more formal. Trumpets. You move toward the source, up a road lined with torches, until you reach the forecourt of a modest marble building surrounded by guards. The gold eagle standard out front tells you everything you need to know. This is the imperial court, and someone important, maybe even the emperor, is inside. It's an event of state. And yet from within the walls comes the unmistakable sound of someone sneezing. Not once, not twice, 4 times. What you're about to witness is rare, one of the strangest, most short-lived edicts in Roman imperial history. The time an emperor outlawed sneezing. The emperor in question was Numerius Pulcher, an eccentric and highly superstitious ruler who reigned, depending on the scholar, either for 6 months or just under 3 weeks. Records vary, and so does belief in whether he even existed. Regardless, legend holds that Pulcher, a man obsessed with order, found sneezing so disruptive, so spiritually chaotic, that he sought to ban it completely, at least in his presence. The edict was called the Edictum de Sternutamentis, or the Sneeze Edict. It decreed that no person within 20 paces of the emperor may sneeze, speak of sneezing, or carry sneeze-inducing herbs on their person. Those in violation would be removed from court and made to walk backward across the forum wearing a clothespin on their nose and a placard reading, "Wind-born and undisciplined." Yes, seriously. The edict was said to have originated from an imperial banquet. During a toast to Jupiter, one of Pulcher's advisors sneezed loudly, causing the emperor to spill his wine. The emperor, interpreting this as a divine insult, declared sneezing a sign of moral weakness and ordered the man removed. Then he decided the only way to preserve imperial decorum was to rid his court of sneezing altogether. Historians still debate whether this story is a satire invented by rival senators or based on an actual decree. But regardless of its origin, it became one of the most infamous examples of Roman micromanagement, a ruler trying to legislate biology. To enforce the edict, Pulcher established the Office of Respiratory Discipline, a small group of guards trained to monitor nasal behavior. They carried small feathered fans, not for cooling, but for gently brushing people's noses to test their sneeze threshold, and wore herbal wreaths to diffuse volatile winds. If someone even looked like they were about to sneeze, furrowed brow, twitching nose, hand to face, they were required to announce, "I am not possessed, I merely itch." If they sneezed without warning, a bell was rung, the room was cleared, and a priest summoned to reharmonize the air. Naturally, this caused problems. Pulcher's ministers began developing silent sneeze techniques, using throat control, breath training, and famously, biting down on slices of cold turnip to suppress the impulse. A black market trade in anti-sneeze tonics popped up overnight, with vendors selling vials of honey and powdered laurel bark said to muffle the inner breath. People grew terrified. One noblewoman reportedly fainted from trying to hold in a sneeze during a state ceremony. Another man is said to have sneezed into a cup of water to disguise the sound, only to be fined for sacrilege against Neptune. Even animals weren't safe. A court cat, known only as Tactus, sneezed during a stormy evening gathering. Pulcher reportedly ordered it to be exiled to a farm in Etruria and replaced it with a tortoise. The emperor himself was rumored to have held in sneezes so forcefully that a physician was assigned to monitor his forehead veins. That physician later left a note, half poem, half plea, on a wax tablet. "Let breath go, mighty lord, or breath shall go from thee." But Pulcher wasn't entirely irrational. To account for accidental sneezes, he introduced the sternutatorium, a sneeze chamber installed near the palace garden. Anyone who felt the urge had to excuse themselves and walk, silently and without eye contact, to the chamber. There, surrounded by scented linen and muffling walls, they could sneeze freely into a cedar bowl and leave behind a small prayer token. The room even had a scroll rack where you could record what you were thinking at the time of the sneeze, for later divine interpretation, of course. One scroll read, "Sneeze during thoughts of figs, awaiting signs." Another simply read, "It was dust, please do not exile me." Still, public opinion soured. The people mocked the law, whispering fake sneezes behind Pulcher's back and printing satirical graffiti like "Even Jupiter sneezes." One pottery maker began selling figurines of the emperor holding his nose, and a popular street song included the line, "A man who fears his own wind cannot steer the state." Eventually, the backlash caught up. During a crowded imperial hearing, a child in the audience sneezed 3 times in quick succession. The sound echoed like thunder. Pulcher froze. A priest in attendance stood and said carefully, "We have heard the will of the gods, and it is wet." The crowd erupted in laughter. Even Pulcher cracked a smile. That evening, the Edictum de Sternutamentis was quietly repealed. The feather fans were returned to the garden. The placards were burned. The tortoise stayed, however, it had grown popular. Historians still debate whether Pulcher truly feared sneezes or simply sought control over unpredictability. But the episode lives on in Roman memory as a cautionary tale. You cannot outlaw breath. And yet the sneeze, so personal, so uncontrolled, had once again proved its power. Because for all the empire's laws, aqueducts, conquests, and coinage, even Rome couldn't silence the simple act of air escaping the body. Not permanently, not completely. Even emperors had to sneeze eventually. You walk away from the palace, the stars blinking into view overhead. The torchlight flickers and the wind shifts. Somewhere in the city, a sneeze erupts, followed by laughter, maybe a blessing, maybe just silence. And it hits you again. In ancient Rome, a sneeze could be everything. A sign, a scandal, a spiritual message, a social signal, a lawbreaker, a lawmaker, a joke, a sneeze. So simple, so human, so impossible to control, just as the gods intended. You leave the flickering torches of Pulcher's court behind, stepping down the winding road into a quieter Rome. The palaces fade into the background, the laughter of taverns dims, and the city begins to settle. But not all is at rest. not yet. Because in a modest neighborhood near the Aventine Hill, just behind a temple dedicated to the household gods, you stumble upon something curious. A small open-air amphitheater, no larger than a garden. Stone benches form a semicircle, and in the center, a man in a tattered cloak paces, dramatically holding a scroll. An audience of maybe 20 people sits, hushed but attentive. You take a seat at the back, just in time to catch the title being proclaimed in a booming nasal voice: The Trial of the Sneeze Spirit. It's a play, a comedic farce, one of many that sprang up during Rome's golden era of satire and stagecraft. And tonight's feature? A hilarious and biting takedown of Roman superstition, particularly the empire's bizarre relationship with sneezing. The star of the play is a character named Spirai, a mischievous little wind spirit who lives inside people's noses. According to the play's mythology, Spirai escapes every time someone sneezes, looking for a new nose to inhabit, and along the way causes all kinds of trouble, changing election results, misleading travelers, or even knocking over sacred offerings. Historians still debate whether Spirai was a true folk belief or entirely a theatrical invention. Either way, the Romans loved it. The idea that a tiny invisible creature could cause so much chaos through something as natural as a sneeze, too tempting to resist. The play unfolds in absurd episodes. In one scene, a priest sneezes while giving a funeral blessing, and Spirai leaps out shouting, "Oops, that one's not dead yet." Chaos ensues. In another, a general about to declare war sneezes and claims, "It wasn't me, it was Spirai," only to be dragged off by his own soldiers for divine impersonation. The crowd roars when a noblewoman blames Spirai for knocking over a vase during her dinner party. Her guests agree that no human could possibly produce such spiritual force. The message is clear: the sneeze has become an excuse. And not just an excuse, but an entire cultural mirror, reflecting how Romans dealt with the unpredictable, the embarrassing, the bodily, and the divine. Because the sneeze, by this point in history, wasn't just a reflex. It had become a character in its own right, a mythic intruder, a symbol of fate barging in through your nostrils without knocking. This play is only one example. Roman literature and poetry are sprinkled with references to sneezing spirits, breath demons, and nasal omens. One satire by Juvenal mocks a wealthy merchant who keeps a slave whose only job is to interpret his sneezes before he decides whether to invest in a new villa. In another poem, a woman sneezes during a romantic walk and her suitor panics, convinced the gods are warning him she'll bear twins. The sneeze had become comedy gold, but it was also more than that. Romans told sneeze stories the way we tell dreams. At dinner parties or in bathhouses, someone might say, "You won't believe what happened. I sneezed during the final dice throw and won everything." Another would reply, but was it a dry sneeze or a wet one?" A third might whisper, "Mine bent to the left yesterday. I stayed indoors all afternoon." These weren't just jokes. They were tiny myths, personal, often ridiculous, sometimes believed, sometimes not. Historians still argue how much of this was satire and how much was sincere. But even the satirical stories reveal what the Romans valued: signs, cycles, and a sense that life, however random, could be read like a scroll if you only looked closely enough. In some circles, people even began assigning personal meanings to their sneezes, similar to how others read dreams or bird flights. You might hear someone say, "If I sneeze twice in the morning, I won't speak to my sister today." A mid-meal sneeze means someone is talking about you. If you sneeze while writing, burn the letter. It carries falsehood. You pause here because that last one actually caught on widely. Roman scribes and letter writers began keeping small bowls of scented oil near their desks. If they sneezed while composing something important, they'd dip the corner of the scroll in the oil as if to seal in truth and drive out the wind. And no surprise, vendors began selling sneeze-proof ink. Was it real? Not really. But that didn't stop anyone. Of course, this all created problems in legal settings again. During one famously absurd case, a will was challenged in court on the grounds that the deceased had sneezed just before signing it, and therefore the document was influenced by unclean wind. The judge's verdict? The sneeze had come from the right, which was traditionally considered favorable. The will stood. But from then on, It became custom for scribes to add the note, "No sneeze observed at time of writing," at the bottom of formal contracts, like a disclaimer. You pass a scribe's shop now, and there on the window is an ad written in red ink. "We bind scrolls, wills, and breath. Sneeze once, get a free sealing wax upgrade." There's no escaping it. From myth to market, the sneeze had permeated everything. It had become a narrative device, a punctuation mark in real life. And for playwrights and poets, it was irresistible. One dramatist even wrote an epic comedy called The Wind of War, where entire battles are won and lost because generals sneeze at the wrong time. Another penned a tragedy in which a man fails to declare his love because he sneezes mid-sentence, and the girl takes it as a sign of disinterest. You smile at the absurdity. But then again, haven't we all had moments where something small and ridiculous, something like a sneeze, completely changed the course of a day? Or made someone laugh? Or snapped the tension in a room? The Romans just wrote it down. They didn't try to control the sneeze. They gave it a name, a job, a Baxter costume. They put it on stage and laughed at it. But they also respected it, because they respected anything that reminded them of their limits. After all, for all their conquests, their laws, their aqueducts and arches, even the greatest Roman couldn't stop a sneeze. It was one of the few things that remained universal. So they made peace with it. They made art from it. And in doing so, they turned the smallest bodily burst into something timeless. You stay through the end of the play, applauding with the others as Spirare escapes through the audience, laughing and sneezing all the while. The cast bows. Someone near you sneezes in real life. Another person blesses them without hesitation. And for a moment, you can't tell where the stage ends and Rome begins. The actors take their bows, and the laughter slowly dissolves into the rustle of robes and soft footsteps on the stone floor. As the crowd filters out, the scent of incense mingles with the lingering garlic of festival snacks, and a hush falls over the street once more. You step into that quiet, the moon glinting off polished rooftops as you descend the hill. But something odd catches your eye. A modest household shrine, no bigger than a cupboard, nestled beside a doorframe, flickering with lamplight. And inside the shrine, not Jupiter, not Venus, not even the Lares or Penates. Instead, a tiny clay bust of a nose. That's right, a nose. Complete with flared nostrils and etched cheekbones, its surface polished smooth by reverent fingertips. This is no joke. You found yourself in front of a private sneeze altar. You've heard whispers about these, tiny domestic shrines dedicated not to a specific god, but to the concept of breath, wind, or the body's natural omens. While the temples didn't officially endorse them, and you'd never see one in a patrician's villa, they were common enough in the homes of freedmen, bakers, and minor merchants. People called them altaria spiritus, or altars of the breath. And here's the curious part. These shrines weren't for worshipping a deity. They were for acknowledging the sneeze as a moment of contact, a collision between body and spirit. A little reminder that something mysterious still lived inside the skin. Each family had their own ritual. Some left peppercorns and thyme at the base of the bust to honor past sneezes. Others tied small red threads around the nose sculpture after particularly meaningful sneezes, such as one that occurred during childbirth, or just before a long journey, or during a major decision. You glance closer now and see what looks like a sneeze journal, a scroll on a small wooden tray beside the altar. Yes, people kept those too. In it, each family member recorded their significant sneezes for the year. Today's entry reads, "Marcus sneezed 3 times before market, sold all figs, offered thanks." You flip back a few pages and find, "Lucia sneezed while weaving, knot pattern improved, left mint in thanks." And even, "Guest sneezed from left, conversation turned sour, no more lentils for Lentulus." Historians still argue whether these practices were true spiritual rituals or just quirky family traditions. But what's clear is this: sneezing for these people was deeply personal. They didn't wait for priests to declare meanings, they made their own. It's this shift, from public to private, from grand temples to household shelves, that marked the final evolution of Rome's sneeze obsession. The transition from external omen to internal compass. The sneeze became a dialogue between your breath and your beliefs, between your instincts and your superstitions. You didn't have to consult an augur to understand a sneeze anymore. You could just feel it, remember what you were thinking, and draw meaning for yourself. This was especially important in a time when formal religion began to fragment, when imported deities, mystery cults, and early Christianity began weaving into Roman life. In the chaos of spiritual identity, sneezing offered a little something grounded, universal, and comforting. It was yours. You move on now, walking past more doorways. Some have similar shrines. One even has a bell that rings softly when the door opens, tied to a ritual where every visitor blesses the house by sneezing at least once inside. If you don't sneeze, you're offered a pinch of pepper as a prompt. The sneeze, they say, clears your spirit so your presence doesn't disturb the home. Another house has a sternus box on its porch, a wooden collection tray where guests write down the thoughts they had during their last sneeze and leave them anonymously. The host reads them at dinner. One note says, "Thought of my mother, then sneezed. Miss her today." Another reads, "Sneezed during anger, decided not to send the letter." It's part confession booth, part oracle, part therapy. And this personal connection to sneezing wasn't limited to the living. Among the more mystical sects in Rome, especially those who combined Roman rites with Eastern philosophies, sneezing was thought to thin the veil between the worlds of the living and the dead. They believed that when someone sneezed, their soul momentarily shook free, just enough to allow ancestral whispers to pass through. If you were quiet and still right after sneezing, you might hear a message. If you sneezed near a grave, it meant the buried were stirring with memory. Of course, most Romans took this with a grain of salt, or maybe a sniff of vinegar, but there are recorded cases of families visiting tombs and deliberately provoking sneezes by carrying herbs or pepper with them, hoping to spark a vision, a dream, a word from the other side. One early mystic even claimed that the sound of a sneeze was a sacred syllable, akoo, that mirrored the divine breath used in creation myths. He was mocked by most scholars, but revered in fringe circles, especially among candle makers and spice merchants, who liked the idea of their products holding prophetic power. Even children got in on the act. In some neighborhoods, children's lullabies included lines like, "When you sneeze at night, hold your breath tight. A whisper may come from the stars' soft light." And they played games where sneezing was part of the rules. In one called Catch the Wind, the goal was to guess what another child was thinking about when they sneezed. If you guessed right, you earned their sneeze ribbon, a little fabric token kept on the wrist. It was innocent, sweet, and deeply Roman. Because through all its stages, from superstition to slapstick, from state policy to personal ritual, the sneeze had managed to weave itself into every layer of life. You pause now at the top of a narrow stairway. Below you lies the river, dark and slow. Above, the stars blink and a faint wind lifts your hair. Someone in a distant house sneezes. You don't know them. You'll never meet them. But for a moment you feel connected. Not just to them, to all of them. The farmers who blessed each other before dawn, the augurs who squinted at feathers and sky, the bakers who called out peppered prayers, the emperors who feared their own breath, the children clutching ribbons, whispering poems about spirits made of air. It wasn't really about the sneeze. It never was. It was about finding meaning in the moment when the body does something you can't control, when the wind escapes, when you can't pretend anymore, when something inside says now. It's ridiculous, it's poetic, it's human. And in Rome, they leaned into it. They didn't say ignore it. They said watch it. They didn't ask why sneeze. They asked why now. And in that tiny pause between inhale and explosion, they found a way to believe again. The night is cool now, Rome holding its breath in that fragile hour between yesterday and today. You walk slowly along the riverbank, where old stone bridges stretch across the dark Tiber like sleeping giants. The wind carries scents of basil, smoke, and something faintly sweet. Figs, maybe, or roasted pine nuts. There's a stillness here that feels like a page waiting to be turned. But as always in Rome, there's one final twist. Because here, at the river's edge, tucked beneath the arch of a bridge, once blessed by Vestal virgins, you find a circle of stones. They're warm to the touch. Not from the sun, they've been rubbed, sat on, prayed beside, and in the center, a small bronze plaque. You kneel to read it. It says simply, "Here the first blessing was given. May wind bring you wisdom." This is the rumored birthplace of the Bless You ritual. Yes, the first time someone ever responded to a sneeze with words of kindness. According to legend, part fact, part fable, it began here during a plague. The story goes like this. Rome was sick. A fever had crept through the city, silent and merciless. People collapsed in markets, temples, doorways, and one day a young girl sneezed as she crossed this bridge, just once, but loud enough to echo against the stones. An old man sitting nearby, himself gaunt with illness, turned and whispered, "Be blessed." Just that. Nothing grand, no spell, no diagnosis. "Be blessed," she smiled. And though no one knows what happened to her after that, people started doing the same, offering little bits of grace after each sneeze, not as a cure, but as a shield, a gesture of solidarity, of acknowledgement. Because in a time when breath itself had become dangerous, what greater gift could you give someone than a blessing for their next one? Historians still debate the accuracy of this tale. Some say the phrase came from a pope, others trace it to Greek influence or military tradition. But the story of the girl and the old man persists, quietly, persistently, like a whisper carried on wind. And that really is the perfect ending to all of this. Because over the course of your walk through shrines and stages, palaces and porches, you've seen how a sneeze was never just a sneeze. It was a conversation, a dialogue between body and world. A spontaneous act turned sacred, silly, strategic, and everything in between. Let's remember just how far it reached. It shaped military superstition, deciding whether men marched or stayed. It influenced legal proceedings, contracts, and declarations of war. It led to festivals, feasts, contests, and even prophetic duets between lovers. It inspired poets, playwrights, mystics, children's games, and house rituals. It provoked imperial panic, spawning absurd laws and the creation of sneeze-proof rooms. It birthed entire trading industries in herbs, talismans, ink, and blessed cloths. It was embraced by the faithful, mocked by comedians, and immortalized in stone. And underneath all of it was the same unchanging reality. A sneeze comes when it wants. It reminds you you're not entirely in control, that you're made of air and impulse and nerve endings, that you are, in fact, alive. Romans understood this better than most. In a world obsessed with order, stone roads, legal codes, imperial ranks, the sneeze was one of the few things that couldn't be scripted. It cut across class, age, belief. It interrupted speeches, broke the silence of temples, threw a curve into carefully written scrolls. And so they gave it ritual. They gave it meaning. They gave it room. Even if the reasons varied, fear of spirits, joy in omens, garlic season antics, it all came from the same human instinct. To make sense of the sudden. To find comfort in the uncontrollable. That's why they blessed each other. Why they decorated their doorways with sneeze altars. Why they looked into their friends' eyes after a sudden burst of air and said, without hesitation, "Health to you." Because when you bless a sneeze, you're not just reacting to sound or germs. You're acknowledging presence. You're saying, "I see you. You're still here, and I hope you stay." Maybe that's why the phrase survived. Why every culture in its own way has a version of it. Why even today, in a world of disinfectant and data and noise, we still pause to say, "Bless you." Salud, Gesundheit, live long, health, even when we're strangers, even when we're in a rush, because part of us still remembers what the Romans knew, that there's something sacred about the smallest exhale. You take one last look at the plaque and touch the warm bronze. A breeze rises behind you, carrying the scent of river water and distant fig trees. And then it happens, right on cue. A sneeze, maybe yours, maybe someone else's, just around the corner. But it echoes through the stones just the same. And without thinking, without checking who's watching, you smile and whisper back, "Be blessed." Wind down begins. So now, let's slow everything down. Let the edges blur. Let the weight of the day fall away like ash from old incense. The streets of Rome quiet behind your thoughts. The breath in your chest grows softer, steadier, lighter. The strange and wonderful rules about sneezing begin to feel like distant dreams. Not facts anymore, just stories. Gentle stories. Ones you've carried with you longer than you realize. Maybe you remember now the last time you sneezed and someone said, "Bless you." Maybe it didn't seem like much at the time. But now? Now it feels like a tiny shield, a small act of kindness, a ritual passed down not because of germs or gods, but because we all want to be seen, even when our noses revolt. So let the night take you now. Let your eyes grow heavy like curtain folds. There's nothing left to worry about. No omens, no feathers, just wind and silence and rest. You are safe. You are whole. And the breath you carry into sleep is the oldest story of all.